comforting and protective. Dogs and children alike frolicked in the white powder, and the hearth fire became an even more welcome refuge. The men of Wolfgarth had transitioned to a new phase. The harvest had been brought in, but the absence of the young bucks in their first block of trials meant the men had guard duty more frequently. Hunting trips also took them away, for hunting was not a dedicated trade but an activity engaged in by all, so as to keep their skills sharp for the day when more dangerous targets might present themselves. Connor was growing a beard, something he did for the colder half of the year before shaving it off in the spring at Brigid's request. Edelston had no such inclination, which suited Phoebe. Few men in the cities had beards, and Edelston wanted to keep himself ready for scavenging. But it was rare for him to scavenge in the winter, for while he could handle the weather, it would be difficult for anyone he brought back, especially children. He was gone more frequently with the Rangers, however, and in discussions with the men's council. On those evenings, Silverlock's sons came over to chop the wood for Phoebe without her even asking for such a favor. Then, too, there was the training of the new bucks, for which Edelston was uniquely suited, and not just in the areas of combat and survival. He had acquired a considerable knowledge of history and had lived under the Retribution, and such a perspective was invaluable for the young. But to a man like Connor, too old to have benefited from Edelston's instruction and too young to have lived under the Retribution, the events in the Outlands were an insoluble riddle. Phoebe learned this one evening when he and Edelston had returned from the council. The ranger evidently had it in mind to question Phoebe, to see if this more recent arrival from the Outlands might make more sense than his friend the scavenger. "Lady Phoebe," he said as he puffed on a pipe, "your husband tells us of what goes on in the Outlands. But it is difficult for someone who is Garth-born like me to understand the Retribution. I mean to say, I know what it is, but how is it that Outlander whites put up with it? There are still enough of them out there that if they were united, they would be a formidable force." It was a question with no easy answer, and she had to ponder it for a while. It was strange to think of the Outlands as that outside world in contrast to the Garth, because only now could she fully appreciate how confining that world had been. It was as if, instead, the Outlands were the enclosed space, one vast prison, and only in this small community could one be free. The Retribution, she had come to see, was really a mental state, a framework for looking at the world. It had been imprinted on her from early childhood through countless classroom lessons and activities, 1,000 little confrontations on the playground, the public celebrations of diversity, the billboards and commercials and movies, and all the daily moments of social friction as whites were blamed by every other racial group for their own troubles and failings. But how to explain that to someone who had never experienced the Retribution? "Well, they all believe in it," she started to explain. "The whites, I mean. I think even the ones who tried to fight it in the early years felt a sense of guilt." Guilt. Guilty for what? What was not to feel guilty for? She thought, I would have to start with page 1 of Retributional Civics and the Rainbow Nation. All of the evil times can be divided into 3 parts. The primeval era, the medieval era, and the evil rights era. All these differed from each other only in the means by which whites subdued other races. Got it. He was waiting for her to go on, to offer the explanation he was looking for, when in fact she had already given it to him. Perceiving his confusion, she elaborated. In the rocking chair with Fiona, smiled through pursed lips, all too familiar with her husband's boisterousness. Even Edelston, normally stoic, was grinning at him. The ranger finally collected himself, wiping a tear from the corner of his eyes. "I'm sorry, Lady Phoebe. It's just, well, why do you suppose we occupy this land that the Garth sits on? I mean to say, why do you think no one has taken it from us? Clearly, we're not allowed to own land by Outland law." Phoebe thought back to Bear Garth, and the fate of the lions who had dared to attack it. I suppose because they know you will fight them for it. We certainly will. We would fight for every square inch. And we would leave behind a land so blood-soaked it would be of little use to any conqueror. Connor glanced over at Ethelston. I know this much about the Outlands. Someone has a piece of paper that says he owns a piece of land. Nations, too, have pieces of paper, and they draw maps. Some may even claim that a god gave them this or that patch of ground. But a piece of paper has never stopped one country from invading another if it truly wants to. And a god won't come to your rescue if your nation cannot defend itself. And even if one did, there are, after all, many gods. So no nation on earth can hope to survive by appealing to such a notion as rights. It must be ready to defend itself, as a man must be prepared to defend himself and his family. The Indians understood this, as did the Europeans who came to this land. Connor puffed on his pipe as he looked into the fire, and it was as if he could see in its hot flames all the misery of the Outlands. What I can't wrap my mind around is why, if our ancestors understood these unbending laws of nature, why their descendants allowed themselves to be duped into giving it all away. They didn't even put up a fight. Maybe they had been made to feel guilty for so long that they lost their instincts for survival. If your words are true, Connor said ruefully, then they did it to themselves. And they must also have agreed, maybe not all at once, but here and there, over generations, that this is what they would teach their children. From her rocking chair, Brigid joined in and asked Phoebe, so the retribution, it gave the land back to the Indians. To a few, Phoebe acknowledged. But there weren't that many of them, and most had no interest in farming. A large area, a big part of the whole country, was handed over to the Mexicans. In school, they told us that the whites had taken this land from Mexico, so it was only right to give it back. Mexicans? Brigid asked. Who are they? It hadn't occurred to Phoebe that Brigid wouldn't know. The city of many apples, though far north of Mexico itself, had such a large population of Mexicans that it seemed they must have always been there. But she knew that was not the case. Ethelston stepped in. They are a mixed race, formed from the Indians and the whites from Spain, a European nation. Centuries ago, the Spanish conquered a great Indian people, the Aztecs. So these Aztecs, Brigid said, pursuing the matter, then they were the first people in that area, in Mexico. They were still invading other lands and enslaving other tribes when the Spanish arrived. That made it easier for the Spanish, because many tribes viewed them as liberators. Races who each conquered land, who stole land from other peoples. Seeing Ethelston nod, Connor snorted. Farms didn't even exist before our folk arrived. I'll bet the farmers were like us. They turned what had been a wilderness into cultivated land. Generation after generation, patiently working the soil, and then what? To lose it all, not to a conqueror but to, what? A feeling of guilt. I just can't understand it. It wasn't just that, Phoebe rejoined. They made us feel guilty for everything. The fact that whites owned slaves, for instance. When was this? Connor asked. Well, it ended just before the Evil Rights era, about 250 years ago. Concluded as much when she thought about how there had always been more whites than blacks. How could each white own slaves, or even one slave? But somehow that didn't matter, for they were all guilty. Ethelston rescued her. Only a very small number of whites ever owned slaves. And many whites came over from Europe after slavery had ended. So that reason makes as little sense as the other, Connor concluded. Are they trying to say, then, that only whites own slaves? I've never heard of other races having slaves, Phoebe said. She turned to Ethelston. Did they? He nodded. All of them. In fact, the Arabs had more African slaves than whites ever did, and they treated them far worse. The Chinese had slaves, the brown Indians did, and the red Indians, too. Even the Africans themselves. In fact, most of the blacks brought over to America were enslaved by their fellow Africans. It was there before whites set foot, and it was around long after they left. There were even Indians in America who owned black slaves, and blacks who owned other blacks as slaves. Let's say I strike Edelston here without cause. He can strike me back, although if it's serious enough, he can take the matter before the men's council and demand compensation, correct? But let's say I strike him, and he does nothing, because he's too afraid. Then, 200 years go by, and we're both long dead and gone. Then his great-grandson's great-grandson demands compensation from my great-grandson's great-grandson, saying that I hit Edelston once upon a time. Would that stand? Let's even say I murdered him instead. Would it still make any sense? Phoebe thought back to her classes. They told us that all whites were guilty, because even after slavery, they benefited from it. White privilege, they called it. Whites had better job prospects, they had more success in school, and so forth. She looked helplessly to Edelston. Were whites ever slaves? Yes, and not just in ancient times, when the Romans brought many Celts and Germans under their boot. In fact, our very word, slave, comes from the fact that it was the fate of so many Slavs, an entire branch of our people. The Arabs, the Turks, and the North Africans were raiding Europe for slaves until 2.5 centuries ago, when Europe and America were finally strong enough to end it. Many a daughter of Embla ended the line of her people by being made to serve the desires of a Turk or an Arab, or a North African pirate. The dominant way of thinking for over a century. So why are whites, today, to be punished, by preferring every other race to them? Because their ancestors were successful. I would be ashamed to blame my problems on whether a distant ancestor of mine had been a slave or was conquered in some war. I know from reading the Roman that in ancient times, slaves were won through combat. Those who were defeated, or rather, those who accepted defeat, became slaves. Why should the victor feel guilty? For winning. It was a point of view Phoebe had never encountered or considered. Here was a man who questioned not just whether it was right to blame posterity for slavery, but whether it was something even the original generations should apologize for. Brigid added, from what I've heard about the Outlands from Edelston, it sounds like every race looks after its own interests, just as we do here. But somehow they got the Outland whites to put the interests of others before their own. Here in the Garths, we don't believe in universal values that everyone in the world must abide by. No one but whites ever has. Our principles are those of the folk. They reflect our character. They are ingrained in us, and we hand them down to our children. The one who rejects them in favor of his private whim is an outlaw. The one who rejects them in the name of universal principles is a zealot, and every bit as dangerous. They sat in silence for a while, then Connor spoke. I was 6 years old when I lost my family. My father and mother were killed, my older brother, my baby sister. If any of the lions of Detroit still walked the earth, few men could blame me for wanting to seek vengeance. But the boar took care of that, and Leonidas afterwards. Even though I know what the lions did to my family, and to all those bear children who were my friends, I can tell you honestly that I never feel the desire to go to Detroit and kill the lions' children, who are now grown like me. Heard about from centuries ago. And I have never considered the loss of my family as an excuse for any of my failings. Thanks to my father, who died rather than accept slavery, I was able to escape, and I am a free man. I am responsible for my own actions, for my successes and defeats. I make my own orlog. Orlog. The term was unfamiliar to Phoebe. Yes, orlog. Orlog is Connor struggled to explain. It means primal law. It is the effect of all the deeds of our past on our present. Her confusion must have been visible, for Edelston said, "Remember when I told you that a man is like a tree? Just as rain falls and nourishes the soil, and the tree draws this up through its roots, so we are fed by our own deeds. Each deed is like a drop of rain, or the dew that collects on the leaves in the morning. We are watered by what we have done, what we have chosen to do, and that starts to affect what we can do and what we will do. Once the rain has fallen, it can't be taken back. Just so, once a deed is done, it can't be taken back. It has fallen into the soil, and you will draw it up. There is no absolution, no forgiveness of sins that wipes the slate clean, because we are not blank slates. When we write upon ourselves, we do so indelibly. You can't escape the past, the layers of orlog that you yourself have deposited. 51, so it's fate. No, not as you mean that word. That would mean we have no choice, no free will to play in what comes about. The only certainty is that you will live with the effects of your past. Your past is inescapable, but it is also of your own doing. So think of it as a kind of fate you make yourself. Let's say I let my body become weak, by being lazy day after day. Then I am fashioning a fate in which I cannot defend myself or those closest to me. Of course, there are other things that can narrow our range of choices, but nothing can take away choice itself, how you choose to react to the world. Vision how the past is always acting upon us. Brigid added, and even though you cannot undo a deed, you can alter its effects over time. Think about when I was showing you how we dye cloth black. Phoebe thought back. We used the hulls from the walnuts your children collected. We boiled them in a pot, then we strained the juice, and added vinegar and salt. Then we put in the cloth and kept boiling off the water. What if, Brigid asked, instead of boiling it off, we added more water instead? The dye would be more spread out. But it would never go away entirely. No, Phoebe agreed, the water would never be pure again, not completely. But it would gradually get clearer. In the end, you might not even be able to see the dye. Think of that pure water, Brigid said, as the good deeds you do each day, and the times you act when you could have failed to act. I see it now. You're saying that we can't escape what we have done, because it will always be there. But we made it ourselves, and we can choose to weaken its impact by the good that we do. That's exactly right, Brigid said. We're not up against fate or an all-powerful God, but we're not entirely free, either. We reap the effects of what we have sown, and not always in ways we can foresee. A family is also like a tree. It, too, has a well, only all the members of the family contribute to it through their deeds, for good or ill. By mid-November, Phoebe had been at Wolf Garth a month, and most of her waking hours were spent at Brigid's, learning from her the way her own daughters did. The course of instruction was not formal, for she learned as things arose. Gradually, she became aware of a certain rhythm to the day and to the week, and she suspected that she would eventually discern a rhythm to the year, as well. Being able to feel that rhythm, or to recognize it when she felt it, had been something that life in the outlands had deprived her of. She was never so conscious of how artificial modern life was until she became aware that another way was possible. Looking back, she realized how fake everything had been. Fake food, fake clothes, even fake people. There had been a profound emptiness, a shallowness to life. She struggled to put all this in words, as she and Edelston talked one night. He nodded in understanding. It's capitalism. It may not have created that empty feeling, but it feeds off of it, cultivates it. It needs you to be unhappy, because if you were content, you wouldn't want to buy anything, or at least not enough. Once you've bought that one thing that you think will bring you happiness, it soon leaves you feeling empty inside, and capitalism starts to stoke that feeling all over again. And to make all those unnecessary things, whites have gone from being people who took pride in their craftsmanship to becoming drones, herded into factories, content to push a button mindlessly for hours. Capitalism flooded the country with cheap immigrant labor, but wisely hid the cost of that by also flooding the country with cheap goods. It doesn't care what race the consumer is. It'll make money by making him think he's different, even as it chips away at those differences, because it's easier to make money off of people if they're predictable. Many. Bill. His words did resonate with her own observations back in Many Apples, yet she felt that there was more to it than that. Eggleston could explain the negative things she had experienced, but not the positive things to which she was awakening. Only now, in Wolfgarth, did she feel like a woman, and delight in it. And only now did she see what real manliness was like, and take comfort from it. Capitalism may have effaced that complementarity, but the absence of capitalism was not enough to explain why she felt the way she did. After reflecting on it for several days, Phoebe concluded that there was a rhythm that men simply could not feel as deeply as women. It was as if nature had a frequency that only women could hear. The men of Wolfgarth knew, of course, the cycle of the seasons and when to do what. They could sense the approach of storm and frost, could feel the soil in their hands and know what it contained. But these signs were all knowable to the senses and to the mind well versed in reading them. Yet there was a nature beyond nature, a face behind the mask of greenery, and it was a woman's. It was there in the way a woman's cycles matched those of the moon. It was there in the way the women of the Garth could feel the presence of life growing within, before even one of those cycles had failed of completion. It was there in the magnetic pull toward children, the selfless worry and concern for them, until the mother had absorbed the entire family into her very being. And it was there in the innate sense that despite death's seeming victories, nature would find a way, for rhythm means continuance. Discovery of that inner frequency was a revelation for Phoebe, for the modern world had deadened her reception of all that nature intended for her to feel. It robbed women of their cycles, left their wombs empty, and made children undesirable. It sundered ties of kin and weakened ties of friendship, leaving the woman completely alone, then bade her live in the modern world as a man might, a solitary hunter. Most of the women she had known in the city accepted this or even embraced it, this idea that they were just like men. They ignored the rhythm when they heard it, tried to silence it with endless noise. They bullied and crabbed, seduced and manipulated to get their own way. And when their own decisions had left them with an ocean of regret in an otherwise empty self, they blamed everyone but themselves and became even more bitter. Just as the men of the Garth were a different breed from the men of the city, so, too, did the Garth's women bear no resemblance to their outlander counterparts. Phoebe smiled as she reflected on the irony that the women of the Garth had more power than the women of the city could imagine. Not the power that modern women sought, the stark exercise of the individual will over others, but power such as they could never dream of. The power to take the earth's produce and conjure up food that would nourish boys into strong men and girls into graceful women. The power to grow life inside, the matrix of all future generations. The power to be, oneself, the sole food for a baby who would one day bestride the earth like a colossus. The power to heal, to clothe, to mend. The power to calm the storms of the youthful and ease the troubles of the aged. And yes, the power to draw a man to you, not for an hour or a month but for a lifetime, to keep him seeking after the mystery that lies within you. Such power befit a goddess, for such power she had shared. All this the women of the city could never imagine. And yet all that power, if the same word could describe such different things, was matched by an utter and joyous dependence on man. For like the earth, a woman longed to be cherished, and lovingly tilled, and fought for as something precious. The mystery of woman, the quest of man, these were two parts of one whole. Outside the Hall of Women stood a stone with this inscription. Because we are the only ones who give birth to men. Brigid said this came from a story well known to every woman in the Garth. In ancient times, a woman of Athens, a bustling city, was curious as to why women in Sparta were treated with such deference. The Spartan called no man master, yet he called his wife Despoina, mistress, the female equivalent of master. To the casual observer, Sparta seemed to be a place where women were in charge. So this woman asked Gorgo, wife of Leonidas, why is it that you Spartan women are the only ones who can rule men? The answer given by the wife of that valiant king was etched in stone at Wolfgarth. 52 Phoebe could see the truth in this. In a way, the retribution had won before the shadow ever fell across the sun. Decades before that, in fact. Its victory was sealed once women had stopped giving birth to real men. A society that had men like Connor and Edelston and Liam would never consent to the erasure of its identity. But such men did not spring up out of nowhere. They were raised and loved by women who knew what a man should be. Except Edelston. But Phoebe was starting to suspect that in all the years since Portland, his path might indeed have been guided by a woman, one she herself had met in the woods. Inside his copy of Homer's Odyssey, Edelston had written a poem, a sort of offering to Freya. Among those verses appeared these lines. And then, through gathering storm clouds of rain, raining her cats, she came, chariot thunder wheeled, wielding beauty, her eyes blue as the ocean tide, tied up in braids, her long flaxen hair. Intruding on long years of struggling worship now appeared, with no master, only mistress, goddess beautiful in tears, tears of hair framing a face beyond words. He may not have seen her in the forest as Phoebe had, but these lines indicated a man who felt her presence, heard her voice in his blood, and responded to her in verse. Do not, then, think me odd by her presence, presents I give, gifts of rhymes onset, the chill days of autumn. Surely a man such as this, though orphaned by the retribution, had been shaped by a female presence as formative as the paternal guidance of Leonidas. Phoebe, too, was an orphan of the retribution, not because her parents were dead but because she had none of the skills that could have connected her with previous generations. But now Brigid was patiently imparting those skills to her. Gradually, Phoebe was gaining confidence in her burgeoning abilities, less embarrassed of the paltry dowry of talents she had brought to her marriage. For under Brigid's tutelage, every day she learned something new or honed that which she'd learned the day before. She was becoming a more confident cook and had successfully made Edelston several meals. There was a unique satisfaction, she learned, in pleasing a man with food. His favorite dish of hers so far was one Brigid called samp porridge. It required soaking beans overnight and leaving hulled corn to simmer for most of the day. Most of the food was like that. It took a long time to prepare, but most of that time she was free to go about other tasks until maybe an hour or so before the meal. Then she would chop up carrots, potatoes, and onions and add them in, along with salt pork. And there was usually plenty left for breakfast the next day. Phoebe also made food for him to take with him when he left the Garth on business with the Rangers or Bucks. Centuries before the retribution, the women of this area would make a portable meal for their husbands, the Cornish pasty, a durable pastry of meat and vegetables. This the men would take into the mines, for copper and iron were abundant here. Today, the women of Wolfgarth did so not just for the miners, but for all who ventured out, lumberjacks, herdsmen, farmers, rangers. And so did Phoebe, as the scavenger's wife. Fried apple pies were another treat, and they were easy to make, using the apples they had bleached back in October. Her first batch, however, had the tang of sulfur, something Edelston chivalrously pretended not to notice. But after Brigid showed her how to use as little water as possible, the second attempt was a success all around. There was nothing preventing the Garth, Phoebe realized one day, from doing such things on a larger scale. It would be more efficient, perhaps, if all the food were prepared in common kitchens and then divvied out uniformly. But then, it would be more efficient if everyone lived in barracks and handed their children over to appointed stewards. The preparation of food, however, like the rearing of children, was something so intimate to family life that they would not obliterate such a bond in the name of mere efficiency. There was a role, of course, for the clan, just as there was a role for the Garth, and even one for all the folk of the Northern Sea. But underlying all of it was the family, the true foundation of society. Bridget's daughter Nimue had left some time ago, and what with Liam also away at the trials, Bridget's middle daughters had grown quite close to Phoebe. Colleen, named after Bridget's mother, had pale, freckled skin, with strawberry blonde hair and soft brown eyes. She was 13, just starting to emerge from the awkward phase of adolescence. It was odd to think that in 3 years she might marry, but Colleen had a knowledge and maturity that could never have been found in a girl her age outside the Garth. In the city, girls her age were already sexual objects, but that race to adulthood had the effect of retarding their moral and intellectual development. The girls in the Garth had been allowed to be children, and that, oddly enough, had imparted a more profound maturity, one based on hard-won experience, not crass imitation. Maureen was 3 years younger, with coppery brown hair, deep blue eyes, and a funny way of crinkling her nose when she bit the sewing thread. Where Colleen was quiet and shy, her younger sister was openly curious and talkative. But while Colleen was more subtle about it, it was obvious that both of them wanted to hear about life in the outlands. They were most curious to find out what Phoebe must have learned, if in 19 years she had not come to know any of the female arts. Phoebe's answer, that she had learned nothing, perplexed them. They could not imagine a world in which people were so infantile as to not know how to feed and clothe themselves with their own hands. The girls showed her how, if a difficult task should frustrate her, to set aside some of what she was working on, a bit of wool or cloth, or a bit of cooking flour on a plate. They would then offer this to Frigga, queen of the gods and wife of Odin. If a girl dreamt about it that night, then the next day, she would have more success and often find that the skill came more naturally to her. Thinking back to Bridget's analogy of the gods as teachers, Phoebe came to realize that nearly all aspects of the household were Frigga's domain. Not just spinning, weaving, and sewing, and the cooking and preserving of food, but also marriage and motherhood. These last two, however, she shared with Freya and a goddess named Sif. Bridget's daughters told her of Frigga's hall in Asgard, where many handmaidens aided her. Lyn, who protected men in battle who were her favorites. Saga, who kept the lore of the folk. Ire, who healed the sick, and many others besides. All of these were skills and duties of women, and so it was natural that women turned to Frigga for guidance. Brigid herself had been named after the Celtic form of Frigga. The gods of the folk had gone by many names among the peoples of Northern Europe, Phoebe had come to understand. The traditions, rites, and stories told about them were as diverse as the branches that once flourished on the folk tree, although the essence was fundamental as their blood. In the terrible pruning that came later, however, much of this had disappeared without a trace, or only the names remained. So the folk spoke to the gods using the names of the far north, and relied upon the lore where it had been best and most fully preserved. Frigga, Colleen and Maureen told her, knows what is to come yet does not reveal it. Phoebe recalled what the Roman had observed, that the tribes believed that all women had this intuition to a certain extent, that husbands and sons listened to them for a clue as to what was in store. This power, both to prophesy and even to shape the pattern of things to come, was visually embodied in the act of weaving. Just as the pattern emerged from the weaving, so, too, did life emerge from the warp and woof, the interplay of causation and will. This, too, was part of the pattern, the rhythm, that women were more apt to perceive. Phoebe herself was becoming skilled with the distaff and spindle, and making the thread that would be used for linen. When she first laid out flax, it looked remarkably like the tresses of a woman's hair. Flaxen hair, as they say, agreed Brigid. Like Sif's. Sif, she explained, came from the elves, beings who tend to nature as a dwarf tends to his forge, crafting great beauty from it. Her brothers, the sons of Ivaldi, were great warriors who fought alongside the Vanir against the Aesir, in the great war between the gods. In the peace that followed, many marriages sealed the breach, and one of them was the marriage of flaxen-haired Sif to Thor. Phoebe had heard of Thor, but she was unaware that he was once the most widely venerated god of their race. The Celts had known him as Tyrannus, the Thunderer, the Slavs called him Perrin, and the Germans, Donner. Even that branch of the folk that had gone east to India honored him, before they were gradually subsumed into the darker races. For it was Thor above all who kept the worlds of gods and men safe, as he warred upon the Jotnar, the devourers who sought to unleash chaos. He could be heard in the thunder, in the storms that brought the summer rains, quickening life in the crops. But for all this, he was not a god of warriors, like Tyr or Odin, but the patron of the working man, the god of hard work and family, of good food and drink, a dependable companion, the friend of man as he was called. He was quick to laugh but also terrifying when provoked. His weapon, the hammer, was in essence a tool, much as the laborer will use whatever is at hand to defend his family. So beloved was he, that long after the cross replaced the hammer, men went on calling the fourth day of the week Thor's Day. In Brigid's description of Thor, with his great laugh and flashing eyes, Phoebe was reminded of Connor. 53 Sif as Thor's beautiful and loving wife, Brigid told her. Many young mothers take Sif as their model and are devoted to her. Together, Thor and Sif have many young children, whereas Frigga's children are grown. It was still difficult for Phoebe to grasp this concept of divine procreation. When she mentioned this, Brigid replied, "But of course the gods have children. I believe the Christians' God had a son." Yes, but Thor and Sif are true husband and wife, and together they create new life. It is no more strange that a being higher than us should have children than that one lower than us should. Many young brides and mothers turn to her, for she is as they are, and she understands them. I'll tell you one story my mother told me. It is one of my treasured memories of her. 54 Phoebe knew her mother had perished in the fall of Bear Garth, when Brigid was only 5. Looking at her now, Phoebe was struck by the idea that her own mother might have turned out like Brigid, had it not been for the retribution. Wayland was killed. But that is another story. As part of the peace, she came to Asgard, the Garth of the gods, and married Thor. He loved her dearly. Sif was beautiful, and most radiant of all was her golden hair. This she cherished, because she knew her husband adored it. This story, too, has to do with Loki. You must understand that Loki is the arch-traitor. He once walked with the gods and exchanged vows of brotherhood with Odin, but he was a deceiver. Like the devourers whose blood flows in his veins, he jumps from one hateful pleasure to another, without any principle or higher purpose. There were times when he aided the gods, but only because circumstances forced him to. And that was before his full crimes came to light, when he was banished and bound. But all of us have the potential to become like Loki. We must struggle against the giant nature that would have us give in to every desire and urge, regardless of the consequences. Loki despised the love of Sif for Thor, because if he could not have something for himself, he wanted to destroy it. So one day, while Sif was lying asleep outside, her long hair all about her, Loki cut it off. When Sif awoke, all her hair was gone, every last strand. When Thor came home, his wife was not there. He searched high and low for her, asked about her in the halls of the other gods, but his beloved wife was nowhere to be found. Then, as he was returning to his hall, Lightning crack it is called, he heard someone whisper his name. From behind a stone a woman stepped forward, a veil covering her head. Thor didn't know it was his wife until he heard her voice. Sif was distraught. She thought he wouldn't love her anymore because of her appearance, because of her bare head. It seemed hideous to her. But when he persuaded her to take off her veil, he was not repulsed by the sight, but enraged. For while Thor is a merry god, he is quick to anger. It didn't take long to find out that Loki was to blame. All of Loki's cunning would not have helped him if Thor had got his hands on him, but Sif persuaded her husband to take the matter before the council of the gods. Sif and Thor entered hand in hand, but such was her shame that she wore the veil. The council of the gods gave the summons that must be obeyed, and when Loki arrived and saw Thor's flashing eyes, even he trembled. The council ordered him to restore Sif's hair, which was no small task. So Loki went to the dwarves, the dark elves as they are sometimes called, who dwell in a world set apart for them. They are master craftsmen, who forge objects of immense power and beauty out of nature. Loki gave them a bar of gold and asked them to hammer it into threads finer than anything else, for such was Sif's hair. He played upon their vanity until they agreed to undertake the work. So they worked in their forges until the threads were as fine as they could be. When the dwarves picked up the finished work, bright as the sun, it flowed through their fingers, so light that a bird would not feel its weight. Loki returned with it to Asgard and appeared before the council. Sif took off her veil, and when he pressed the hair to her bare head, it held there, magically. The hair of gold cascaded down over her white shoulders, and all were struck by her beauty. The gods were pleased, and Loki escaped Thor's wrath, at least upon that occasion. But happiest of all was Sif, not for her golden hair, but for the golden sparks in her husband's blue eyes, when he gazed at his beloved. Brigid's eyes, too, sparkled with memories. When I was very little, I wanted to have golden hair like Sif. Once when I was 4, I told my mother that I was going to cut my hair off, so I could get golden hair like Sif. My mother laughed and said, "Why would anyone reward you if you acted like Loki and did such a horrid thing? And where would you find the rubies to give to the dwarves to replace it?" Then she told me that my red hair was more beautiful than gold. My mother would tell me that I could see Sif's golden hair in the crops that were growing in the fields, in the wheat that shines in the sun. Like Sif's hair, it would be cut at harvest time, but it would return in the spring, as golden as ever. When I was older, a budding woman, I remembered my mother's story and realized that there is more to the story of Thor and Sif. When Thor and Sif make love, it is like the thunderstorm, and Thor's rain falls down upon Sif's fields, as together they make new life. The metaphor of rain and field was vivid enough to make Phoebe shift in her chair. There was a paradox in Brigid, which Phoebe recognized in all the women of the Garth. Despite shouldering the burden of raising 8 children and teaching her daughters all that they would need to know to be mothers and wives themselves, she did not appear angry or sullen, the way Phoebe had come to expect of outland mothers with even one child. Her femininity shone as brightly as it must have on her wedding day. She could charm her husband, and it was clear to anyone with eyes to see that they were in love and desired each other. Considered in this light, Brigid was undeniably sensual. In fact, there were times when Phoebe, raised in a world pervaded by ret porn, felt prudish in comparison to Brigid's earthiness. Once, while she and Brigid were talking into the late hours, Connor came home alone, for Ethelstan was still instructing the young bucks. As he unloaded some firewood by the hearth and headed back out for another load, Brigid told Phoebe that it was probably time to call it a night, since it was time for her to nurse. Without thinking, Phoebe remarked, "I guess I didn't hear the baby wake up." "Oh," Brigid responded, one eyebrow arched and a mischievous smile on her lips, "she's still asleep." Yet seen in a different light, Brigid was positively puritanical. When Maureen and Colleen pressed Phoebe for information on life in the Outlands, Brigid would not allow any mention, or even a hint, of what Outlander women allowed to be done to themselves through their loss of self-respect. Phoebe had to remind herself that the things she had taken for granted as a child of the Retribution were completely unknown in the Garth. Brigid might have been a goddess of love herself, but had she been shown a photo of Retporn, she would have burned it as zealously as any Puritan. But perhaps there was no paradox here. The outland cities sold sex, or the illusion of sex, to every buyer, yet there were no people more miserable than the Outlanders. The city had denied men and women the opportunity to be themselves. And so the androgynous masses trudged along, their heads bent down, the sexless and joyless inhabitants of a hellish, overcrowded landscape, possessing no desire to raise others like themselves. In the Garth, however, there was no prostitution or adultery, but there were child nights, and ring matches, and a dozen other ways in which man and woman were brought together. Perhaps there was no paradox, either, in how Brigid could be the gentlest and most attentive of mothers, yet ice-cold and merciless when faced with anything that threatened what they had in the Garth. Phoebe witnessed this late one night when both of their husbands were gone. She was telling Brigid about the Outlands, when Brigid asked her about the era and how it was enforced. Phoebe struggled to explain how it didn't need to be enforced for everyone, for most whites had no interest in having children. Then how did they avoid pregnancy? Brigid wondered. Phoebe discovered that she was unaware of such things as the contraceptive pill. Brigid was shocked that the childless life, which women in the Garth regarded with horror, was apparently some kind of ideal among whites in the Outlands. In the Garth, the rare couples who could not have children of their own would eagerly adopt any of the remnant rescued by Ethelstan. Abortion, however, she understood, and cut Phoebe off. Brigid then told her of a woman in the Garth, years ago, who had killed her unborn child. It was a matter the women handled on their own, as was their right. The woman was branded on the forehead lest any Garth be fooled. A small pain, Brigid said, for what she had done to her baby. Then she was banished, to make her solitary way through the ironwood. Brigid, looking directly at Phoebe in her unnerving way, added, I do not doubt that such horrors happen in the Outlands, but here in the Garth, there was no excuse, no circumstance that could possibly mitigate such a crime. This was the most innocent of lives. Some of the women would have preferred to execute her instead. I was among their number. No matter. One day she will face the thing's dead, and it will be seen if her ancestors stand by her or abandon her in front of the gods. Phoebe could not suppress a chill at the thought. Brigid, seeing her reaction, went on. Connor and I were the sole survivors of Bear Garth, apart from Leonidas, who was with the Boers when it happened. Had Connor and I perished with our families, this house would be empty. But instead, its walls resound with the laughter, the tears, and the dreams of so many children, our children. None of them would exist if Connor and I had died in that wood. We carry with us all the hopes of Bear Garth, those who died there, those who have no descendants. I feel them all around us, like a cloud of witnesses. My own mother died so that I could live, and so I cannot imagine why anyone would willingly wreak a Bear Garth upon their own womb. Brigid became silent, pondering something. Then, you know that I had a son before Liam. I know you know it. Tara told me you saw him. That is when I knew she had truly seen him as well. After she told me on winter nights, I came back down here and cried. I ached so much for my little boy. But in spite of it all, I was happy, too. Happy that the veil lifted enough for you and her to see him. I would give anything to see him again. But for that, she inhaled sharply, then let it out slowly, I must wait. Brigid's hands were idly playing with needle and thread, as if she were imagining all the things she might have made for her son as he grew older. Quinn would be 19 now, 2 years younger than Nimue. He was very young when he died, Not quite 2. I was pregnant with Liam then. Quinn had always been a sickly child, but we loved him dearly. He had Connor's eyes. His hair was blonde, though it might have ended up turning brown as he grew older, like Connor's did. In spite of his illnesses, he was more spirited than any of the other children, always running around and crashing into things. We could see that he was sick, and we knew he needed medicine, but nothing we have here seemed to help. Leonidas scavenged books, and from them he concluded that the boy might have something called hepatitis. There was something wrong with his body, it couldn't fight off infections. So Leonidas went south, to one of the Chinese cities, Wasiwa I think it was, to find medicine there. But it was too late. If he had found the right medicine early on, Quinn might have lived. Bridget's eyes welled with tears, and she let out a sob. Phoebe put her arm around her, and they sat together for a while, the silence broken only by the mother's stifled cries. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to be like this," she sniffled. "Still remembers him. But I remember thinking that I would have given anything to have had that medicine when we first suspected he was sick. And later, I thought that if we lived in the outlands, he wouldn't have died. But then I realized, in the outlands, he would never have been born. Or if he had, Connor and I would have been shipped off to a green factory, and they would have taken our son for his organs." In the years that followed, as I watched my children grow, I also watched the Outlander children that Leonidas scavenged, and my thoughts changed. My little boy may have died before his second birthday, but he had a fuller life than many an old-timer redneck does out there. He was free, born to free parents, to a father and a mother, who loved him dearly. We would have laid down our own lives if it would have helped. His time was short, but in that time richly lived. And, having lived that life, he awaits us in the next. He is with his ancestors, and I know his grandparents watch over him well. She sniffled again. How many people in the outlands, I wonder, how many have a child and yet do not? Do you understand? How many of them fail to cherish their child? How many of them sleepwalk through life as their child grows older? How many are strangers to their own blood? Whites had discovered that medicine, but they also invented devices that make children and parents strangers to each other. I know, Leonidas would tell me, and I could see the children he scavenged. I talked to them. That is how it is in the outlands, how it has been for a long time. People are numb, scarcely alive. The most horrifying things happen, and they don't feel a thing inside. Those around them get sick, grow old, and die, but all they worry about is the inconvenience to themselves. Then one day, they themselves are old, or dying of disease, for there are plenty of diseases they have no medicine for. They look around, hoping that others will care about them, really care about them. But they know they'll soon be burned to ash and then the inconvenience will be over. Did they ever live? What is there to show that they did? Are we here just to entertain ourselves? How many of them would trade years of those empty lives for just one day of my son's, to know what it is to be truly loved? She wiped at her eyes. There is a stone out there with Quinn's name on it. But the proof that he lived is here. She touched her chest, in my heart and in my husband's, and in these walls that still resound with children crashing into things and laughing and being loved. And, then she sobbed once more, but this was a deep, heart-wrenching triumph of joy over grief. She began to cry. She wept because she had had doubts, even after everything in the forest, and with Ethelstan, and Tara by the fire. It was too easy to see it as false because it was inside her. Even with Tara, there could have been some other explanation. So she cried, because now doubting seemed such a monstrous thing. She tried to explain it to Brigid, but the words tumbled out haphazardly, snatches of fears and regrets and hopes all mixed together. But when she had finished, Phoebe was surprised to find Brigid smiling at her, the tears still in her eyes but slowly being blinked away, one by one. and cannot really know. If you did know it, you wouldn't need to believe. But you do see it, not just Quinn, everything. No one is asking you to believe anything. You have all the proof you need in your own body. How can you doubt in Freya, when you can feel her stirring inside you, the quickening desire? How can you doubt in Frigga, the mother of us all, when you feel that pull, stronger than the moon's? How can you doubt in Heimdall, when you feel his blood flow in your veins, and see nothing like it in any other race? How can you doubt in the gods, when you bear their gifts? Yes, Phoebe, daughter of Virginia, there really is an Odin. Like him, you have sacrificed yourself to yourself, pleading through tears for the strength you lacked, only to find the secrets have been given to you. Don't believe. Don't disbelieve. Just embrace who you are, to the very root and marrow of your being, and you will find something sturdier than belief, for it cannot be shaken. Wisdom. I don't sit up at night wondering if the gods exist, for I can feel them in me. You know, they say whites once had technology so advanced that they could land on the moon and send machines to other planets. They could look at the smallest particles in the body, and they could talk to someone on the other side of the world. And yet they couldn't explain why we feel the way we do when we look up at the night sky filled with stars, or the magic that we feel when we hold our baby, or what it is like to love. They couldn't explain the most important things. But Freya is that desire and that love. Frigga is that nurturing feeling, just as Thor is the joy and the righteous anger. To doubt in them, I would have to doubt in myself or deny my nature. But I can feel their spark in me, and in my husband. We have their blood in us, Phoebe. Other races may have been made in the images of their gods, but we are more like our gods than we are like them. We think like they do, strive like they do, and honor what they do. I do not need to believe. I just have to open my eyes to the way the world is. But what about the river? Phoebe asked, and the 9 days' journey, and the Thingstead, and all the rest. Surely you cannot see them. No, Brigid conceded, but there have been those who have had visions of such things. I have not, unless a dream can be a vision. So, why do I trust in the ancient lore, you ask? Well, for one thing, I trust in it because it is old, because it is ancient. It has been tested. Our ancestors believed these things for many thousands of years, and they were not a foolish lot. They had to endure far harsher conditions than people today. Back then, foolish people did not live long. It's only recently that we've come to a point where you can do foolish things, or believe in nonsense, and escape the consequences of your mindlessness. I don't know, maybe that moment has already passed, and the retribution is the end. But it is the modern world that has shown itself to be gullible, not the old. It is the modern world that taught us we can all be brothers and join hands. So I do not think our ancestors would have honored the gods and goddesses for so long unless they had good reason. I don't know. Maybe that moment has already passed, and the retribution is the end. But it is the modern world that has shown itself to be gullible, not the old. It is the modern world that taught us we can all be brothers and join hands. So I do not think our ancestors would have honored the gods and goddesses for so long unless they had good reason to do so. But it also makes a great deal of sense to me. None of the gods, as mighty as they are omnipotent. There are forces of evil and chaos so strong that only the greatest of efforts by the gods keeps them at bay. In fact, it is such a close-fought war that they need our help, or at least that of the mightiest of us, those who continue to develop greater power and love and honor and wisdom. The Christian God has his angels, but he doesn't really need them, and he doesn't need us. He can do it all himself, for there is no power anywhere near as great as his. The Christian devil, as I understand it, is but a wayward angel, and he and all his companions together could not commit a single evil act unless God allowed it. The gods are strong, but they are not all powerful. Like us, they try to protect their families, their kin, and their beloved friends, but they do not always win. Odin is haunted by the knowledge, gained at great personal cost, that when the great battle is fought, he will not survive it. Surt, the devourer, will come from the world of fire, Muspelheim, carrying the sword of vengeance that Wayland forged long ago, and with him will come Loki, and Gulveig, and all their monstrous ilk. When Heimdall blasts his horn so that all the 9 worlds hear it, then the holy powers will march to battle alongside the heroes of Valhalla. And Odin and Thor, and many gods besides, will fall. Yes, even this he knows, and yet he prepares for that day. Their best efforts will not be enough, just as the best efforts of my father and mother, and the others, could not save Bergarth. Sometimes the forces of evil are simply too great. To a small child, parents are like gods. They are mighty beings whose powers seem limitless by comparison with your own. But circumstances forced me to learn too soon, much too soon, that some things are stronger than even my parents. Yet their love for me, which was more powerful than their desire to stay alive, allowed me to live. In the same way, our Lord tells us that the rending of the world, like the fall of Bergarth, will take our enemies with it. The sun and the moon will be swallowed up, and the waves will burst their boundaries and submerge the land. But it is not a total defeat, just as Bergarth was not. Middle-earth will rise from the sea once more, and the sun will return to the sky. The children of the gods will reclaim Asgard, and Frigga's son Balder will lead them. And our world will once more be peopled by our race, for a man and a woman will be hidden in the forest. As they say, Leif and Lifthrasir will be hidden in the forest of Mimir. The morning dew shall be their food, and from there new ages will be born. 55 And the world will begin again, as ours has. That same story was told, in various forms, by all the peoples of our race. It has been told so many times that I feel it must be true. We are like Leif and Lifthrasir, Connor and I, you and Edelston. We are the ones hidden in the forest, so that some may survive the flood tide of retribution. And through us, the race will renew itself. The nights became longer and colder, and then, in the 3rd week of November, they learned that the men's council would be sending Connor to Islandia, to meet with the jackals and the elks. The council had been working on plans for the new Garth, which was to be founded in the spring, but there was a desire by many not only in Wolfgarth but also Jackalgarth to survey this new land themselves. They wanted to get a better idea of what the new settlers could expect, and what kind of support they would need. Normally, winter was not the time for such journeys if they could be avoided. But since the first group of settlers had to arrive early next year, to start planting and building immediately, the locations and dimensions had to be finalized now. After the heavy snows, it would be too late, and putting it off until the spring thaw meant that much less time to prepare. Connor was to depart on the 21st with a few farmers and craftsmen to Jackal Garth, and from there they would sail across to meet the Elks at Islandia. Allowing several days to examine the island, the whole trip would take about 2 weeks. Edelston would not be going, as there was no need for a scavenger on Islandia. Phoebe was grateful for that, for she knew that when winter was over, he would be gone often enough, for such was the life marked out for him by his nature. But all of her expectations of what it might mean to be the wife of a scavenger were changed forever the night after Connor left. Edelston spoke to her of other plans, proposals so grandiose that Islandia faded into the background. "I'm all for settling the island," he told her, after they had finished a dinner she had made and were sitting in front of the fire. "But I think we need to be doing a lot more. Because in the end, settling Islandia is a movement inward, not outward." Young man in the Greater Redoubt, he heard of communities deep in the forests of Sweden and Norway, far from the Muslim cities, where the old ways were being revived. Of course, that was nearly 40 years ago. But the same is true on this side of the ocean. Prior to the hunger, the reports were more reliable, but there's been nothing concrete since then. We don't know for sure if any are still out there, but we can't know unless we go look for them. He told her that the Elks were planning to send a team to the east. In the early years of their settlement, the Elks had made brief contact with a French-speaking Garth, a group calling itself La Race Ancienne. By the time the Retribution hit Canada, the mass influx of immigrants had virtually eliminated any chance for the Quebecois, as that branch of the folk was known, to have their own nation once more. For a few, however, it only strengthened their determination that their identity, forged through centuries of struggle, should not disappear from the earth. In the mass disruptions of the hunger, the Elks had lost contact with this Garth, but they felt there was a good chance that it still existed. Now they felt strong enough to consider sending men on such a long journey. The Boers, too, were feeling ambitious. It was as if the Garths had gone through a sort of childhood, and faced their trials, and now they were young men, ready to flex their muscles and take on new challenges. The Boers' ambitions were directed to the south. They were intrigued by rumors Edelston had heard, that a fragment of the Ark had survived its destruction. Because of their own religious background, the Boers felt that they were in the best position to contact Christians, if any still sheltered within the Pale. As for Wulfgarth, there had long been a sentiment, which Leonidas had encouraged, in favor of mounting such an expedition, but the hope had always been a vague one. That changed with the arrival of Edelston, who provided a direction for their hopes, west. In his travels prior to arriving at Wulfgarth, he had heard about a settlement in the Rocky Mountains, usually located somewhere near the Canadian border. As a boy, he had not ventured into those forbidding hinterlands, but things were different now. Were a team to be sent, he would be its natural leader, since he knew the lands to the west and what they might encounter in the outlands. Such a journey, however, would take months, and much would depend on how passable or dangerous the roads were. But the principal argument against the proposal was that Edelston was irreplaceable. He confided in Phoebe that he felt caught in a bind. The council members valued him because of his connection to the outlands, but they didn't want to risk him too much. Phoebe remembered that in his book, Leonidas had mentioned a faction that thought the scavenging should end, and his own death had seemed to reinforce their view. Only Edelston's brilliant performance had kept the profession alive. But surely the same people would argue against a scavenge that would take him to the other side of the country. Even though she didn't like the idea of him being gone so long, she shared his frustration. But winter is upon us, anyway, he noted, and all their focus is on the new Garth. The evenings with Edelston became rarer. Sometimes he worked during the night and slept during the day, for in Connor's absence, he was tasked even more with helping the Rangers train the young bucks. The bucks were on a timetable, and whether Connor were present or not, they had to finish their first phase by Yule. On these nights, rather than lie alone in their cabin, listening to the wind howl outside, she would stay over at Bridget's and keep her company. With 6 children present, the house was still full, but with Colleen being the oldest, Phoebe could tell that Bridget was grateful to have someone older to keep her company. To the children, though, Phoebe at 19 seemed more accessible, more like Nimue perhaps. They introduced her to a game called Kitty Wants a Corner, one of the many they would play when it was too cold to go outside. Maureen started off as the kitty. Colleen, Niall, and Tara each ran to a corner of the living room, leaving the fourth for Phoebe. Ronan generally did as he pleased, running in playful fright from Maureen, who roamed about on all fours. She went first to Colleen, meowing and making faces at her, trying to make her laugh but earning only a tight-lipped smile. Next she prowled in Phoebe's direction, but once her back was turned to the others, Niall and Colleen took the opportunity to switch corners. This prompted Maureen to dive for Niall's corner, but he was too quick. With a suspicious glance over at Tara, she cautiously approached Phoebe once more. She was so successful at contorting her body into ridiculous poses, mewing pathetically all the while, that Phoebe burst out laughing, thus forfeiting her corner. Now it was she who must roam about as the kitty, seeking a corner. The sight of Phoebe's feline impersonation made Tara's eyes, green in the firelight, sparkle with gaiety, but she managed to hold it together. Niall, however, proved an easier target. And so the game went. 56 one night, Bridget entertained the children with another story of tear. With Thor, he traveled to the house of his foster father, a giant of awesome power. There was a fearful confrontation that ended in the giant's death. Phoebe was confused about the relationship between gods, men, and giants, particularly when Bridget mentioned a giant nature within us all. Phoebe remembered what she had said about Loki, but once all the children except Fiona had gone to bed, she asked Bridget to clarify things for her. Not out of nothing or dust, as some put it. We were already possessed of matter, and the power of life, like the lower orders from which we come. This is what is represented by ash and elm. Then the gods bestowed gifts that raised us, step by step, through the higher orders of creation. Blood, the inner body formed in the God's image, the mind, and finally a soul. But back there at the base of it all is matter and energy, and where did that come from? Fire and ice, heat and cold, are the twin poles that gave rise to the universe, out of the void between them, the abyss, the gap of all potentials, Ginunga gap. When these two extremes touched, life began, the life of the primal being, Ymir, the one who roars. In a way, he is the source of everything that came after, every living thing, every embodiment of matter and energy. He was a giant, the source of that race, and he needed no partner to spawn his progeny. And so the giants were the first form of life in the universe. The gods came later and in part are descended from them, but the gods are aware of a higher nature, a higher calling to establish order out of chaos. For the gods, you see, use nature to achieve their ends, whereas the giants are nature. Nature in all its wildness, the forces of sea and storm, the fire and the flood, the earthquake and the hurricane, the biting blizzard and the dreadful drought. Nature that will not be bridled or bound. We have this nature within us, in our most fundamental planes of matter and energy. It is not evil, this nature. It is beyond good and evil, and therein lies the problem. Some of the giants, in fact, possess great wisdom or beauty, like the beauty of a river flowing between green fields, or the gentle fall of silent snow. This clan of giants, for the giants have lineages as all creatures do, is no enemy to the gods, and sometimes helps them. It was Mimir who let Odin drink from his well, the well of wisdom, for Odin was young then and needed every bit of wisdom he could find if he was to bring order to the universe. But first he had to prove himself worthy, and sacrifice an eye so that he might drink. half his vision sunk deep into the well of all that has been. The gods have even wed giants, as Frey married Gerd. We, like them, can work with these natural forces. But we must also be wary, for there is another clan, the Jotnar, the Devourers. They are no friends of gods or men, for they love only chaos. They would crush out life even in this lovely Middle-earth, were it not for the gods' constant vigilance, and above all Thor's mighty work in holding back a winter that would never end. They are nature devouring itself, the cruel advance of disease, the deformed cell that divides and multiplies. They are the running down of the world, the rot and the decay, the unraveling. 57 Something in this struck a chord deep within Phoebe, a childhood memory, a broken cup. She shared that story with Brigid, the memory of a loud crash, then her mother's plaintive cry. Timidly Phoebe had entered the kitchen, and there her mother was, kneeling by the shattered remains of a teacup. Porcelain was the word she used to describe it, pure white with a geometric design in blue. It was the only one left of its kind, passed down from her great-grandmother. And now it lay in 1,000 pieces. Brigid nodded. The rose is cut and adorns your home, but you know that in 2 weeks, it will be dead. Yet you try to hold on to the fleeting beauty. In a drawer, you come across a shirt that your child wore years ago, but which they have now outgrown, and it pains you. We search for the thing that will not fade, that will not age or decay. Compared to one lifetime, it might as well have been eternal. Part of my mother had always been in that cup, the yearning part of her, the hoping part. And then it fell to the ground and shattered. I'll never forget the sight of her tears, the sound of her sobbing as she knelt over what could not be put back together. The wilted rose, the outgrown shirt, the broken cup, Brigid commented. The disorder that sets in, Phoebe said, the moment you lower your guard. The knowledge that no matter how hard you strive, Brigid added, whatever you create will not last. Was just its latest form. There are those who say this is just the way the world is, Brigid observed. This disintegration. Not demons, I would say. It was something even more primordial than sin. The devouring of existence, Brigid offered. Finally fallen asleep at the breast. Brigid put her to bed, and when she returned, picked up the thread of her story. They say that eons passed while these beings ran riot, nature without higher order, life without purpose. But Odin felt that something else was possible. Like us, whom they shaped in their image, inside and out, the gods know the joy of crafting matter into something more, the satisfaction of making something that matches the picture in our mind. The picture in Odin's mind was nothing less than the liberation of the universe from the devourers, and the construction of entire worlds. For this, he needed knowledge of deep mysteries. He hung himself on the world tree, sacrificing himself to himself, killing whatever inside him stood between himself and his goal. 9 days he hung, pierced by a spear, gazing downward into the abyss, pleading through tears. At last he saw them in the deep, the runes, the tools that would give him the understanding he lacked. Screaming in agony, he took them up, and the god that arose was transformed. It is like the trials, Phoebe observed. Yes, the trials of a god. This gave Odin the power to shape events in the world tree, to bring a higher order. He and his brothers slew Ymir, and out of his body they formed this Middle Earth, his flesh the land, his blood the sea. But in their mercy they did not slay all of the devourers, and that has left behind a festering hatred and a growing menace. So, Phoebe thought aloud, ash and elm. We are of nature, so we have giant nature within us. That is so. It means we, too, are always in danger of being ruled by our urges rather than making them serve a higher purpose. Desire, lust, anger, these things are not bad in and of themselves. The real question is who is servant and who is master. We share a nature with the gods, and that is our higher self, our potential. But we also share a nature with the giants, including those who are forever at war with the gods. So each man, each woman, is not only a battlefield. In a sense, each of us furnishes the two armies that fight there. Think of Freya. She awakens desire. That means the desire to create, to overcome every obstacle, to place your mark with deeds. Athelstan said once that the Devourers wanted her, that they demanded her as prize whenever they contended with the gods. And that if they were to gain her, all desire to create would vanish from the world. Our enemies would triumph. Yes, Brigid agreed, because there is another kind of desire, one that does not create but consumes, that spreads rot and ruin. One night, when Connor had been gone for a week and a half, the singer from the Winter Night's Stumble came to Brigid's house at her invitation. Her children deeply missed their father and their older brother, and she thought this would help to lift them out of the doldrums. The singer, whom they called Cornwall, possessed a handsome face framed by hair that had grayed early. He brought his guitar and played whatever they wished. This was, in fact, his trade, to know the songs of the folk and to keep alive their memories and spirits with music. Feeding the spirit was as indispensable a trade as feeding the body. At Brigid's request, he sang one of her favorites, one of the sea ballads that the folk loved so much. Ere the twilight bat was flitting, in the sunset, at her knitting, sang a lonely maiden, sitting underneath her threshold tree. And, ere daylight died before us, and the vesper stars shone o'er us, fitful rose her tender chorus, Jamie's on the stormy sea. Warmly shone the sunset glowing, sweetly breathed the young flowers blowing. Earth, with beauty overflowing, seemed the home of love to be, as those angels' tones ascending, with the scene and season blending, ever had the same low ending, Jamie's on the stormy sea. Blow, ye west winds. Blandly hover o'er the bark that bears my lover. Gently blow, and bear him over to his own dear home and me. For, when night winds bend the willow, sleep forsakes my lonely pillow, thinking of the foaming billow Jamie's on the stormy sea. How could I but list, but linger, to the song, and hear the singer, sweetly wooing heaven to bring her Jamie from the stormy sea. And while yet her lips did name me, forth I sprang, my heart o'ercame me. Grieve no more, sweet, I am Jamie, home return to love and thee. 58 Will Connor return in such a way? Phoebe wondered. She imagined Brigid would be working at her loom or rocking Fiona's cradle as she thought of her husband. Then suddenly she'd turn around, and her husband would be there. I'll play it once more, Lady Brigid, the bard said, if you sing with me. Oh, she blushed, I don't know if I could. Smiled, and when he started up the tune again, she joined him. Her voice, hauntingly beautiful, made Phoebe shiver. Once the bard had left and the little ones had gone to sleep, the two women talked long into the night. Brigid asked her about how she and Athelstan had met. Phoebe found herself describing their forest journey, although she skirted around the trances she had experienced, concentrating instead on how they had grown steadily closer. And Brigid told her about Connor as he was 20 years and more ago. He had been a force to reckon with, even as a young man, for he always felt that his actions must bring honor to Beargarth. Others were strong, but he was strongest, for those shoulders carried a heavy burden. You know, she said, that song, Jamie's on the Stormy Sea, was one they used to sing at Beargarth. We would sit on the beach by the midsummer bonfires, under the White Tower. After the fall, when I came to Wolfgarth, I used to stay awake at night, singing that song to myself to remember the words. I thought I had to get all the words just right in order to see my mother again. Then, without a prompt, without a warning, Brigid unlocked the word chest containing those events from 35 years ago. I didn't understand at the time but only later, when I had my own children. All of a sudden, we heard screams and loud bangs outside, gunshots. My father jumped up and opened the door, and the screaming and clashing became louder. He grabbed for his rifle on the wall and hung his axe on his belt. Before he left, I remember he looked back at my mother. They shared some unspoken thoughts that I couldn't guess at. She ran to him, and they kissed. Then he passed something into her hand. The shouts were close now, but right before he headed out the door, he looked over at me and smiled, and I thought I saw tears in his eyes. It was the last time I saw his face. I don't have a photograph of him. Everything was lost that day. And I remember the first time, weeks later, when I realized that I couldn't picture his face anymore. Every time I tried, it became hazy and then slipped away. I cried and cried, because I felt like I had betrayed him somehow, in not remembering his face. Bear Garth was not large, at least not in comparison to Wolf Garth today. Those were still the early days, only 15 years or so since its founding. My family lived on the far side, away from the gate, next to a hill. The Garth had a high fence, enough to keep the wild animals away but never intended for defense. My mother grabbed me and led me out the door, heading for that back fence. As we headed quickly down the street, I looked the other way and said, "Look, Mommy, it's Daddy." There he was at the end of the street, facing away from us, and coming at him were more people than I had ever seen, the dark lions of Detroit. For a moment, my mother was frozen in terror for him. By that time, my father must have used up his ammunition, because he dropped his gun and brought out his axe. We watched as he screamed and charged into the lions while they shot at him. They shot him but he kept running, and then he was upon them, swinging wildly, cutting men down, until the mob closed about him. Seeing that, my mother let out a sound I hope never to hear again. The next thing I knew, we were running toward the fence. If it weren't for my father slowing them down, I wouldn't be alive today. The smoke made my nostrils sting, and there were loud explosions that shook my chest. When we got to the high fence, she kicked at the planks so that they broke. Not much, but enough for a child to crawl through. She was urging me on, when we heard people laughing behind us. My mother pushed me through and said, "Remember what I taught you. Now run." Those would be her last words to me. Then she turned around to face them. When I was older, I realized she knew that the only chance I had was if she stayed behind. Otherwise, they would have captured both of us. When she said to remember what she'd taught me, all I could think of at the time was what she had been teaching me that day, a little rhyme for children. As my little legs carried me up the hill, I just recited it over and over. Frigga to mend me when they reprehend me, Freya to send me the beauty she lends me, Skadi defends me when harm they intend me, Sif she befriends me when no one attends me. Once I reached a point high enough where I could look back over the Garth fence, I stopped. There was my mother, surrounded by the lions. They were jeering at her, yelling horrible things I had never heard before, things I didn't understand. They had guns, and there was no way she could escape. Then I heard my mother shout so loud that she drowned them all out. "Fools," she said, "don't you realize you're too late? Don't you see my work is done?" Then she reached a hand down into her shirt. The men, taking it as an invitation to do as they wished, came closer and started grabbing at her. Then I saw her arm shoot straight up in the air, like this. Brigid, seeing the events vividly once more, copied the action as she stared into the red embers of the fire, and on her finger was a ring. I remember I looked down at my own hand just then, because I wondered how she could have her ring on, for she had given it to me to look at only minutes before the attack. In all the chaos, I was still clutching it in my hand. Brigid now looked down at her hand, where she was touching the dark stoned ring. Self-consciously, she looked up and said, "It is the only thing I have of my mother's, besides the clothes I was wearing that day, clothes she made with her own hands and which I have kept." I looked up and saw that the ring she wore was different, and it had something long and thin hanging down from it. The whites of those men's eyes grew big in fear as they looked from her hand down to her chest. They turned to run away, but my mother wouldn't let them. She tripped them and grabbed at them, hugging them tight. She laughed as I had never heard her laugh, a frenzied, wild, terrifying laugh. Then an explosion knocked me to the ground, and there was smoke everywhere. Idea what to do. I just clutched my knees and cried. A few minutes passed, maybe longer. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up. It was Connor, a boy about my age, only a year older. He used to tease me, but just now, his face looked so kind. He held out his hand for me, and I took it. Together we ran from the garth, up the hill and into the woods. We walked for many days, heading toward the setting sun. We knew the other garths were in that direction, but we had no idea how far. We ate nothing but leaves and berries, and at night we huddled together. But as long as I was with Connor, I felt safe, no matter how bad things got. A few days later, some of the boars found us. They were passing in the opposite direction, heading for the great work of vengeance they would carry out. I remember the one who found us, a man with a big mustache. He looked so surprised and kept saying, "Kinders." Afterwards, the boars entrusted us to Leonidas, the only other living bear. He took us here, and we were each taken in by families in Wolfgarth. Brigid was silent a while, lost in thought. I realized she meant more than that. When I was older, I understood that those men didn't mean to kill her, but to make her submit to their desires, then sell her off to the flesh markets of Detroit. Her life there would be a kind of living death. Brigid shuddered. What my mother meant by her work was me, giving birth to even one child and making sure that I survived, making sure the ancestral line did not die in this time of darkness. I was the only link in that chain, and her last act was to save my life. Nothing left for her. So she took her own life in order to buy a chance for mine. It didn't matter if the Outlanders understood what she meant or not. She wasn't really speaking to them. She was speaking for the benefit of the dead, to her ancestors and family members, her folk. And she laughed because the Outlanders had failed. That long line would not be cut. I have no doubt that she and my father crossed the river together. Phoebe could not help but recall Edelston's mother, begging and pleading with those who attacked her, confessing her guilt before the vermin that were about to murder her and her husband and even their son, if they had been able to. She could not imagine Brigid, or any of the women of the Garth, dying in such a craven manner. Brigid spoke. Her words, "Remember what I taught you." Those words, too, were freighted with meaning. She wanted me to remember how she had lived, how she had died. Our death, whether we see it far ahead and walk that long, painful mile, or whether we turn a corner and suddenly find it waiting there, only seconds away, how we face it, that is the final lesson we give to those who live on. There were concerns that this would interfere with the survey of Islandia, but the expedition was expected back any day. 5 days after the freeze, the men returned without Connor. At the completion of the survey, he and Koos had sailed back with the Elks in order to finalize the commitments of each Garth. The rest of the men had returned to the Outun with the boars to await him there. When the winter storm froze the sea, they waited 3 more days, then decided to return. They assumed Connor and Koos would wait it out until a way could be found across the sea. Edelston, knowing Connor, was not so sure. There was another route, overland, around the western arm of the sea, but it was not a safe one. It was not the werewolves of Thunder Bay, that desolate city west of Elkgarth, that posed the problem, but the Chinese in Dulu. Such threats might seem insubstantial to one who, apart from the trials, had seldom ventured more than 20 miles from Wolfgarth. Edelston sensed that the ranger, driven by his own impatience and with Koos by his side, would have felt confident enough to make the journey. He shared his fears with the men's council, and it granted the scavenger permission to leave the following morning in order to intercept Connor and Coos. He planned to travel close to the coast, since he felt that two men unfamiliar with the route would do the same. Privately, he expressed reservations to Phoebe. It was now the 9th of December, and snow had transformed the land since the time of their own journey. It would be easier to spot footprints, at least until more snow arrived, but the ironwood was vast. They might pass within half a mile of each other and not know it. Yet he owed it to Connor, and to Brigid, to hunt for him. Connor was no stranger to the forest, but an outlander city was something entirely different. There, the retribution reigned, and Connor, being Garth-born, was completely ignorant of what that might mean. For Phoebe, the prospect of Edelston leaving, which had seemed so abstract when it was months away, was now immediate and agonizing. She clung to him that night, driven by a great need that no closeness seemed to satisfy. She whispered to him long into the night, far longer than she should have, for he had a long journey ahead. Maybe, she thought, dawn will never arrive, or time will stretch out so that this night lasts forever, and he'll never have to leave. She held out longer than he did, and when he finally drifted off to sleep, she watched him breathing. The weak light of a winter dawn found her still clinging to him like a child. Later, she walked him to the Germanic gate and beyond, to the place between the ridges where, 2 months ago, he had turned to her and said, "We're there." By the sign for the old Cuyahoga mine they kissed, and she whispered to him, "Be safe, Edelston." He winked at her. "Don't you know I'm a scavenger?" Then he stepped silently into the snow-decked forest, disappearing all too soon. Phoebe turned back to the garth, the icy wind biting at her face. Chapter 9. The Return. John William Waterhouse, Lamia and the Soldier. Public domain. You may tear apart the baby's rattle and see what makes the noise inside, but there is a veil covering the unseen world which not the strongest man, nor even the united strength of all the strongest men that ever lived, could tear apart. Francis Farcellus Church, 1897-59. Phoebe felt Edelston's absence keenly, an emptiness inside that began small but grew with each day, each hour, each minute that passed. If this is what it's like, she thought, I can't bear to be the wife of the scavenger. During the day, she would still go over to Brigid's house, but in the evenings, she preferred to come back home. Our home, she thought. As empty as it was, it made it easier to imagine Edelston with her, sitting by the fire, next to her in bed. At times, she nearly fooled herself into thinking he was there, perhaps just in the next room. But at other times, it seemed as if he would be gone forever. Her loneliness became almost a physical thing. It was a comforting presence, for while everything that reminded her of Edelston was not Edelston, it still held some of him behind, like a lover's scent on a pillow. There was a ballad of Cornwall's that fit her mood, Lady Franklin's Lament, a sad, contemplative song nearly 3 centuries old. Lord Franklin had been a great sea captain, and like many bearing the blood gift, he longed to explore, to seek out new worlds. He set off with over 100 men to find an ocean passage through the lands far beyond the northern sea, an expedition which would take a year or more. They were never heard from again. As the years passed, and it became less likely that they had survived, his wife, Lady Franklin, did everything she could to find him. She wrote to heads of state and even paid for several more expeditions to look for her husband, but neither ship nor crew was found. You seamen bold, that have oft withstood wild storms of Neptune's briny flood, attend to these few lines which I now will name, and put you in mind of a sailor's dream. As homeward bound, one night on the deep, slung in my hammock, I fell fast asleep. I dreamt a dream which I thought was true, concerning Franklin and his gallant crew. I thought as we neared to the Humber shore, I heard a female that did deplore. She wept aloud, and seemed to say, Alas! My Franklin is long away. Her mind it seemed in sad distress. She cried aloud, I can take no rest. £10,000, I would freely give, to say on earth that my husband lives. Long time it is since 2 ships of fame did bear my husband across the main, with 100 seamen with courage stout, to find a northwestern passage out. With 100 seamen with hearts so bold, I fear have perished with frost and cold, alas. She cried, all my life I'll mourn, since Franklin seems never to return. For since that time 7 years are past, and many a keen and bitter blast blows o'er the grave where the poor seaman fell, whose dreadful sufferings no tongue can tell. To find a passage by the North Pole, where tempests wave and wild thunders roll, is more than any mortal man can do, with hearts undaunted and courage true. There's Captain Austin of Scarborough town, brave Granville and Penny of much renown, with Captain Ross, and so many more, have long been searching the Arctic shore. They sailed east, and they sailed west, round Greenland's coast they knew the best. In hardships drear they have vainly strove, on mountains of ice their ships were drove. At Baffin's Bay where the whale fish blow, the fate of Franklin no man may know, which cause many a wife and child to mourn, in grievous sorrow for their return. These sad forebodings they give me pain, for the long-lost Franklin across the main, likewise the fate of so many before, who have left their homes to return no more. 60 now, Phoebe thought, I must endure that ancient curse of woman, which Lady Franklin knew well, to wait at home and not know. But then she would remember that Connor had been away for much longer than Ethelstan, his fate much less certain, and her shame only deepened the loneliness. On those long winter evenings, she found herself drawn to Ethelstan's books as if they were pieces of him. These books had been scavenged just like people, and they were no less a part of the remnant. For by scavenging them, Ethelstan had also scavenged the people in those books, the voices and dreams and events of long ago. They had been so close to perishing, but he had rescued them, and now they would have a posterity, just like the folk of the Garth. One of those books bore a woman's name, one of Frigga's handmaidens in fact, Saga, she who kept the lore of the folk. Her name meant story, tale, history. One evening, after heating up water for coffee, Phoebe sat down in her rocking chair and leafed through the book. It contained, she discovered, not one story but many, the chronicles of individuals, of families, of an entire folk as they battled the elements in a cold, harsh land. It was a setting deeply familiar to Phoebe, a people of the North, their identity formed by family and lineage, living in a violent age of disruption and migration. She noticed Ethelstan had marked a certain page with a flattened, dried flower. The words above announced the saga of Eric the Red. Reading it, she encountered someone else whom Ethelstan, in rescuing this book, had scavenged. Eric the Red was a product of his time, a man of violence, outlawed and forced to leave his home. He sailed west until he came to a new land, which he named Greenland. Other families joined him there to seek the freedom of starting life anew. Then a famine came, a hunger. In its distress, the Garth turned to a woman, a seeress named Thorbjorg. She was one of 10 sisters, the saga related, all of whom had had the gift, but she was the last of her line. This intrigued Phoebe, so it would seem, she thought, that this is something that can be passed down in the blood. Did my mother possess it, or my grandmother? Would they have even known it if they had it? Or, like other traits, does it skip one generation or even several, vanishing only to reassert itself all the more? If the whole world deemed such a thing to be impossible, if there were no one to tell them what it was, would the women of my line have ceased to listen, until one day they no longer heard it? When the seeress arrived, the scene became suddenly unfamiliar and strange. The woman was dressed in eerie trappings, the stuff of dark fairy tales, a black cloak decorated with precious stones, a pouch of charms, gloves of white catskin lined with fur, a hood of black lambskin lined with white catskin. Cats, always cats, thought Phoebe, and on her chest was a necklace of glass beads. More than a trace of Freya hung about her, still discernible through the Christian lens of the one who committed the saga to writing. Phoebe thought of the words of Paul, "For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known." 61. Ironically, his followers had helped to darken that mirror through which she now tried to discern, dimly, a picture of herself and who she was. The saga's writer had captured details that he thought were important, but Phoebe couldn't tell if they were also critical to the seeress, or mere circumstance. Some details were those as might lodge in a child's memory, to be recalled decades later, such as the knife the seeress dined with, its handle ivory, two halves enclosed by bronze bands, with a tip that had broken off. The settlers provided Thorbjorg every sign of respect, and the lead farmer, Thorkel, furnished a high seat for her to sit in as she tried to look into the unformed future. One thing was yet lacking to her, however, someone who knew the old chants that would help her to complete the rites. Already, at the turn of the millennium, the old ways were slipping from memory, and the only woman who knew the chants was actually a Christian woman named Gudrid. Here came a conflict of conscience, and Phoebe paid close attention. Gudrid said, "I have no skills in magic, nor am I a prophetess, but in Iceland, Haldis, my foster mother, taught me the songs that she called ward charms." Thorkel said, "Then we are lucky that you have such knowledge." She replied, "I have no intention of assisting with proceedings such as these, for I am a Christian woman." Thorbjorg said, "It could be that you could help the people around here, and for that you would be no worse a woman than before." Thorkel, the farmer, urged Gudrid to help the seeress, for by doing so, she could ease the suffering and worries of many. And so this Christian woman, hundreds of miles from her home, in a strange landscape that edged a new continent, helped enact an ancient heathen rite. The women formed a ring around the high seat, and Thorbjorg sat upon it. Gudrid spoke so beautifully and so well that everyone there said they had never heard a fairer voice recite. The seeress gave her thanks and said many spirits had been drawn to them, enchanted by the sounds. 62. The seeress spoke of many things that had been revealed to her by the spirits of the land, and she blessed Gudrid, saying she would have a long and worthy line of descendants. The saga went on to describe how Eric the Red Sunleaf landed by accident on a new continent. Phoebe recalled something Edelston had said once, during the night of that revelation by the fire. Showing her the Saxon gospel, he told her that the spirit of their people could never be altered completely, no matter how foreign the faith. Those who had been won over by methods less violent than the Iron Kings, ended up remaking their new religion into something more than a little reminiscent of the old. The ancient traditions found ways to survive. It had a toughness, this folk soul. It resisted Procrustes and the creeds by which he measured a man and cut. Then she thought of her earlier experiences with Edelston. Those were not mere visions or hallucinations. They were trances, the outward sign of something happening inside that corresponded to something all too real out there, down the corridors of time and space. It was like being possessed, gripped fiercely by something she had no power to free herself from. "I know why Freya is mistress of both magic and lovemaking," she thought, "for both make us surrender our control as the entry price." 63. Freya was also a mistress of death, the lady of the slain. Phoebe remembered Leonidas' description of his first battle, during the siege of Budapest. The 13-year-old, marked for all but certain death at the hands of the Muslim hordes facing him, kept reciting the names of his ancestors and the heroes of his people. His mind, caught in the grooved tracks of this recital, became possessed by a berserker frenzy as he called it. Uncontrollable as it was, he called it a gift. Someday, when you need it, the battle rage will take hold of you, and you will know what a gift it is. He did not say what god he attributed this to, but for Edelston, it could be none other than Freya. Surely she who led the choosers of the slain could herself possess the slayer. Freya. It always came back to her, to the lady. Surely it was no coincidence that Ethelstan, devoted to that same goddess, had been the catalyst in all Phoebe's inner journeys. Brigid had said that each of the gods had their own favorites. Perhaps Phoebe's own gift was, in a sense, a favor bestowed upon Ethelstan. After all, its genesis was after they had met, not before. Or perhaps she, too, was becoming one of the lady's favorites. With thoughts such as these still on her mind, Phoebe got out of her rocking chair and readied herself for bed. It was frigid under the covers at first, and she shuddered. As her body began to heat up the blankets, she noticed the sound of the wind outside, and the creaking of the timbers. The creaking sounded too regular, though. After listening for several minutes, Phoebe realized that the sound was coming from inside the room. She sat up, and her heart seized in her chest. There, on the edge of the bed, sat a woman. It was Nausicaa as Phoebe had seen her in her mind's eye, rocking the cradle that Leonidas had so beautifully carved. And in that cradle, as it creaked back and forth, lay a baby. Nausicaa looked up at Phoebe and smiled. Phoebe managed to stammer, "But the baby, I thought." Nausicaa looked at her with eyes Phoebe had seen before. In the book Ethelstan showed her, in The Lady in the Woods, in Brigid, and in her own face staring back from a mirror. A woman's eyes, which men could spend eternity trying to depict and never quite succeed. Nausicaa spoke in a whisper, whether because her baby was asleep or because she was speaking from another world, Phoebe did not know. Death obliterates nothing. The woman then looked back to her child, to one who had not been born in this world but lived nonetheless. And suddenly they were gone, mother and child, as if it were all a dream and Phoebe had suddenly awoken. Yet the empty cradle still creaked. For a long while she watched it, as if to catch sight of them again. Nausicaa had carried that child within her, alive but not born. But do we not all carry within us, Phoebe realized, the past generations as well as future ones? In our blood, in the coiling helix that can be seen and measured, as well as the coil that is invisible, immortal. Why have I been given this ability to see through the veil? She wondered. If this is a gift, what am I to do with it? The next morning was exactly 10 days since Ethelstan's departure. When Phoebe went over to Brigid's, she found the whole household astir. Niall let her in, for the girls were helping their mother with baking in the kitchen, and delicious smells from inside wafted toward her. Entering the kitchen, she was surprised to find Nimue there, holding her baby while she talked to her mother. Apparently, the day Ethelstan had left, 2 messengers had also been sent to Jackal Garth, to let them know that the scavenger was looking for Coos as well as Connor. Those messengers had returned with Nimue and her son, at her insistence. She would await her husband at Wolfgarth. The family was busy with preparations for Yule, for tomorrow was Mother Night, the longest night of the year, before its shortest day, the winter solstice. The 12 days of Yule, which ended with the new year, were important to the folk, a great time of feasting and companionship, a time to reflect on the past and to lay plans for the future. As Phoebe joined mother and daughter, she could plainly see that worry for their husbands had brought them even closer. As Phoebe joined mother and daughter, she could plainly see that worry for their husbands had brought them even closer. And they insisted on bringing her into their circle of anxious affection, for events had brought all 3 of their husbands together, to be united in one fate. All was not gloom, however, for Liam was expected the following evening, and the women were keeping themselves busy by making his favorite foods. It was hard to believe that the first of Liam's trials was already over. Bridget's son had been gone for over 7 weeks. As it was, he would be allowed to stay for only 24 hours, reporting back after the high feast of Yule. It seemed harsh to give the young bucks so little time with their families, but Bridget told her that in the early years of the trials, it had been found that too much time back with their families tended to undermine the young bucks' training. So the Garth tried to strike a balance, giving them 7 days throughout the year, coinciding with the feast days, the 8th being winter nights. In a little over a month, in early February, Liam would return for the charming of the plough, the ceremonial preparation of the fields and ploughs. It was a time to invoke the Disir, the female guardian spirits of the line, who helped see to the cycles of nature. There was a Dis for each family and each tribe, embodying the women of the line. It was also a celebration of the turning of the tide against winter, symbolized by Thor's driving back the Devourers, the enemies of gods and men alike. The folk had once preserved the memory of this ancient holiday in the church feast of Candlemas, and, oddly enough, in the prophecies uttered by a groundhog. After that, Bridget's son would return for the spring equinox, the holiday named for Istre or Ostara, goddess of spring. The Garth would greet the Lady of the Dawn at sunrise. Later, the children would look for the eggs hidden about by the goddess' sacred animal, the hare. 6 weeks after that would come May Day, a festive time of maypoles and sword dances, the fertility of the earth and its creatures. It was the time when the corn, wheat, and barley would be planted, a time of birth and blossoming flowers, the season of Freya. Out of the morning land over the snowdrifts, beautiful Freya came tripping to scoring. White were the moorlands, and frozen before her, green were the moorlands, and blooming behind her. Out of her gold locks shaking the spring flowers, out of her garments shaking the south wind, around in the birches awakening the throstles, and making chaste housewives all long for their hero's home, loving and love-giving, came she to scoring. 64 At that point, the young bucks would be halfway through their trials. About 7 weeks later, midsummer was the longest day of the year, when the folk of Wolfgarth would light bonfires on the beach that would burn through the night. The children would look far to the northeast, to see the bonfires lit by the boars midway up the OU Tune, just as the boars would peer across the water, searching for the fires visible beyond Islandia, high atop the great sleeping giant. The girls would gather flowers to put under their pillows, hoping to dream of the man they would wed. In early August, when the barley, oats, and many vegetables were harvested, the young bucks would be reunited with their families for Frifaxi. Frey, the shining god, had been given dominion over the elves when he cut his first tooth, and the ancients would honor him by giving every child a gift as a tooth fee. This tradition continued long after Christianity in the guise of a fairy depositing a coin under a pillow. At Frifaxi, the god would bless the fruitfulness of the earth, the harvest, the late summer planting, and the herds that would breed at this time. It was also called Things Tide, the time of assembly, for it was when a great assembly of the folk was held, with representatives from all 3 Garths, its location rotating each year. Contests in horseback riding were held there, with the best of the young bucks competing for glory against their elk and jackal counterparts. The festival of harvest itself, at the time of the autumn equinox, honored Thor and Sif, and through them every man and woman. Without Thor, Sif would have no safe place, no Garth in which to nourish life, and without Sif, Thor would have nothing to work hard for. Afterwards, the bucks would face their final trial, to return 6 weeks later, on the eve of winter nights. There were other days, other occasions to mark, sacred to clan or family, but these 8 holy days were the rhythm by which the entire community marked the year, and the bucks marked their steps to manhood. 65 As Phoebe joined Brigid and Nimue in their preparations, the women's spirits rose, and the day went by quickly. That night, Ethelstan returned to Wolfgarth with Koos but not Connor. Phoebe's reunion with her husband was brief, for he and Koos had to immediately report before a hastily summoned men's council. After their deliberations, Koos and Ethelstan returned to Brigid's house. The hour was late, and Brigid had already sent her children to bed, though Fiona was still up. The boar then shared with his mother-in-law what he had told the council, while Phoebe and Ethelstan sat nearby. After the survey of Islandia, Koos said, he and Connor had gone on to Elkgarth, for they had been empowered to make the final arrangements among the three Garths there. When the storm came up and made the northern sea impassable by boat, they did not deem it wise to attempt the crossing on foot. A journey of 100 miles over its frozen surface would take several days and not be without risks of its own. Yet waiting at Elkgarth promised no change, for there was no telling when the northern sea would be crossable again. So they decided to return by land. Both men were unfamiliar with the area, so they kept close to the coast as much as possible. When they came to the outskirts of what they assumed must be Dulu, they made a wide berth. But south of the city, as they attempted to cross a river, they ran into men with guns, all dressed alike, Oostmans. Koos called them Orientals. Those, Ethelstan interjected, were the local police. They ran a tight ship in Dulu. The two men had been torn between fight or flight, but Connor surprised him by cooperating with the Oostmans. The boar was not so sure, and when they tried to take his weapons, an argument broke out. He broke free and headed for the tree line. Shots rang out, and he couldn't tell if they were directed solely at him, or if Connor was resisting them. Once in the woods, he heard cars and sirens, but from where he lay concealed, he couldn't figure out Connor's location. He waited until nightfall, but with no clue as to where the ranger might be, he decided to keep heading east. Brigid's face was pale. The boar hung his head and spoke to the ground. "I am so sorry, Mevru," he said, and the words sounded to Phoebe like "my Frau," that is, my lady. "I did not stay with your husband." "No, you did the right thing," she reassured him. "They would have just taken you, too. Or you might have been shot, and we might never know what happened." Picking up his story, Koos told her that the next day he made it to the coast. That night, Ethelstan spotted his fire and nearly gave him a heart attack. The scavenger decided that he would continue on to Dulu. If Connor were in custody, time was of the essence. Koos resolved to go with him. But in Dulu, they found no trace of Connor, and no one had seen anyone that matched his description. Brigid also didn't need to be told that while Connor was abundantly familiar with the forest and its dangers, he would be out of his element in an outlander city. But as far as they know, we're just more organized werewolves. They would want as much information from him as they can get. Phoebe asked what that would mean. Ethelstan explained that such an act would end all ship traffic into the Northern Sea. That would cripple Dulu, which was the Chinese outlet to the sea for exporting the agricultural products from the great factory farms further south. He turned back to Brigid. But cooler heads prevailed. "They want me to return to Dulu, to make a more thorough search." Brigid was lost in thought for a moment, looking down at Fiona. "The town. I scoped out the police headquarters, and that night I even commandeered one of their cars and made one of their men tell me everything he knew about new arrivals in the jail. There's no sign that he's there." The more I thought about what Koos said, the more I started to think, what if Connor was approaching that confrontation like the police were rangers? He would know that the most fatal moment is right at the beginning, when tensions are high and anything can happen. So that's why he acted cooperatively. But he would also know that there would come a time when he would no longer have any options for escape. Somewhere along that line, when they least expected it, he would break free. Ku's resistance may have provided that opportunity. But whenever he did it, he would have been quite capable of eliminating anyone who stood in his way. If he were unharmed, he'd have found his way back here by now. But if he were injured, he'd be lagging behind. But wouldn't you have run into him either way? Brigid wondered. Edelston shook his head. Forest along the iron shield. He's seen Leonida's journal, so it's possible that he has a general idea of the waypoints. And he knows I have cache sites of supplies hidden all along the way. Being the woodsman he is, he would have been confident that he could find them. The whole time we were heading along the coast, I think he was to our south. So he might still be on his way. Brigid asked, clearly worried that her husband might be hurt. Still go. They just said I should return to Dulu along the scavenger way, in case he did act like I thought he would. Brigid studied Edelston. There's something you're not saying. He looked at her, his face grave. Yes, there's something not right about all this. I can't put my finger on it. But it's there. He sighed. Of course I'm going to go, and I'm going to do my best to find him. But I wish I had some way to narrow down where I need to look. He might be on the route, or he might be 5 miles north or south of me. I honestly have no idea. I wish I could tell you otherwise. Phoebe could see the anguish in Brigid's face. My lady, Edelston said, speaking formally, if there is any earthly way, I will bring your husband back. And I will not be traveling alone. Koos, he nodded in the boar's direction, will be coming with me. He refuses to go back to Jackal Garth until your husband is back with you. We'll be leaving in the morning. Koos stiffened and said, Ek is Boar, proudly but without embellishment. I'm sorry, Brigid said. I know if anyone has a chance, it's you. But until I see him again, I won't be able to think straight. The wind howled outside. Connor was somewhere out there. Later. In private, Edelston shared his frustrations with Phoebe. The entire time Koos and I will be wandering around in Dulu, he could be 100 miles away. He sighed. Always going to be brought back in. They realize the Garth needs someone like me, who can operate in the Outlands as an Outlander. But their expectations aren't realistic. The Outlands is a big place. I'm a scavenger, but I'm not like old Jeff. I can't just look down and see everything in the forest, much less the city. Leonidas knew that some of the bear women had been taken to Detroit, and yet he never found them. The prospect of being apart from her husband for an indeterminate time was hard for Phoebe to take. But then she thought of Brigid, and their children. Tomorrow would be the first night of Yule. Connor had been gone for nearly a month. Edelston got up well before dawn. Neither one of them wanted her to accompany him again, down the dark, snowy lanes toward the Germanic gate. It seemed better this way, to kiss him while still in bed and to be able to pretend, later, that he was still beside her and not heading deep into the ironwood. Faintly, feebly dawned the day that would end in the year's longest night. Mother Night, Madranet as the Anglo-Saxons had called it, the dark womb from which light and life would be reborn. Normally, it was a time of great joy, for although the worst months of winter lay before them, the sun would now be on the ascent, and victory was assured. According to the lore, there would come a day when the light would not return, and a winter of 3 years' duration would signal that Ragnarok was at hand. Mother Night was sacred to Frigga, the divine mother, and all mothers were honored through her. Likewise, the sun that would dawn the next day would symbolize the birth of her son Balder, the hope of the gods, and all children were embodied in him. Later that morning, Phoebe went over to Brigid's house. Nimue and Brigid were in the kitchen with the older girls, while the living room was astir with the excitement of Niall, Tara, and Ronan. Knowing nothing of the previous night's news, they were filled with anticipation for Yuletide. It was clear to Phoebe that fear for her husband gnawed away at Brigid, but she hid it from her children well. Surely, Phoebe thought, this was a test of motherhood as trying as any ordeal a man faced in the trials. To love a husband and worry for him so much that it hurt, but to love one's children so much that one had to hide that pain. Mother Night, the opening of Yule, was a time of great anticipation for the little ones. In the afternoon, the lumberjacks dropped off a big fir tree, and little Ronan's eyes grew big as they brought it into the cabin. As the family sipped hot drinks and waited for Liam to arrive, Brigid told the children about the wild hunt. On this night, Odin would lead a winter hunting party, riding Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse that could travel between worlds. If children would leave out hay and carrots to feed the noble steed, then the bearded man of the north would leave them gifts, simple gifts blessed by red-cloaked Frigga, protectress of children's souls. Phoebe seemed to recognize elements of this from stories her grandmother had told. The eight-legged horse had become 8 reindeer, and the memory of Odin, a god of great might and magic, had somehow been transformed into Santa. As with Frey and the Tooth Gift, the common folk had kept their gods by shrinking them down into fairies or giving them saints' names, but underneath the mask, the beating heart of their people continued. Children's imaginations were the living taproot, the connection to that rich soil of the past. The efforts to uproot the ancient traditions had ultimately failed, for one cannot refashion the soul. The spirit will out. Phoebe caught sight of the children gazing at the hearth, where Brigid had hung stockings for each of them, each stitched with colorful designs and bearing a name. Names, Phoebe reflected as her eyes took in each one. Fiona, Ronan, Tara. Names from across the sea, from a people that left their land with sorrow to find hope in this one, only to perish at the hands of the retribution. Niall, Maureen, Colleen. Yet here they were, alive in these children, a cloud of witnesses, as Brigid said. And between the stockings of Liam and Nimue, as if embraced by them on either side, hung a little stocking bearing the name Quinn. A knock at the door made Phoebe's heart leap, before she realized that it would not be Ethelstan. The children rushed to the door, and there was Liam, lean, his hair cut down to a stubble, overwhelmed by the little bodies jumping into his arms. Brigid must have perceived his distress, for she told the youngest to settle down, allowing the young buck to slowly take in the sights, sounds, and smells around him. As they sat down and talked, all except Ronan, who commenced a war between his wooden figurines, Phoebe observed the 17-year-old. Although he was only an eighth of the way through the year, the change was dramatic. He sat at rigid attention, his eyes scanning everything in sight, and when Ronan let out a scream at a particularly dramatic moment in his battle, Liam tensed noticeably before recovering. She struggled to square this person with the now comical, now studious boy who carved a ring for his sweetheart. It seemed that his personality had been stripped away and replaced with, what? Instinct. Obedience. But then Phoebe reflected that his father, too, had gone through the trials, as had all the men she'd seen in the garth. Like a rubber band that was stretched, those men seemed to have returned to their familiar dimensions. The training, rough as it doubtlessly was, had not stripped away poetry from Ethelstan or humor from Connor, so it was hard to find fault with it. Her conclusion was reinforced when another knock came to the door, and Brigid announced that a guest had come to see Liam. There, wearing an elegant crown of green leaves and red berries, stood a girl, or rather a young woman, Phoebe reminded herself, for woman Violet was, being 17. Liam stood up as Brigid escorted their guest to the fire and surrendered her own seat so they could sit next to each other. He waited for her to sit down before doing so himself, then proceeded to fidget nervously with his hands while the women talked to this and that. But Phoebe's eyes caught that subtle moment when Violet, without missing a beat in the conversation, reached over and brought Liam's twitching hand to rest between her own, stroking it gently with a hand that wore a wooden ring. Phoebe noticed, too, the smile that appeared at the corner of Brigid's mouth as the women continued talking. Phoebe knew then that Violet, though she could wed another man rather than wait, would be marrying no one but Liam. Nimue caught Phoebe's eye and the two exchanged a knowing smile. Niall, however, was growing restive, and he began to dispute with Ronan about whether the young boy's war had intruded upon his foot. Phoebe knew that his father's absence for nearly a month had been hard on him. Now his older brother, whom he idolized, was back after so many weeks, but he seemed more interested in the young woman by his side. Brigid was attuned to this, too, for the Husfreya suddenly suggested that they enjoy some cookies and sing songs. Pauline and Maureen proudly fetched what they had made, oat cookies with walnuts and honey, and Niall and Ronan made a hasty truce. Phoebe was helping Brigid prepare coffee and tea in the kitchen, when suddenly she heard children's voices singing in the other room. The holly and the ivy, when they are both full grown, of all the trees that are in the wood, the holly bears the crown. 66. Some memory stirred in Phoebe, a moment years ago, as she stood in a half-empty church and heard a boy her age singing those words. She'd heard it only that once, but ever since, she had tried to remember how it sounded. Now here, a world away, it came to her. She looked up at Brigid in surprise. The woman smiled. Perhaps you are wondering why a Christian carol would be on our lips. I told you once, seldom is anything useful thrown away, certainly not something that speaks to us. And the music, the joy, it does speak to us. She adjusted the kettle. It reminds me of something Ethelstan once said. He'd found a book which claimed that during all the long millennia before the Christian God's Son came to earth, people were trying to find the one God but didn't know his name or his nature. So in their ignorance, in their efforts to find him, they called him by many names. Now I admit, she went on, that is a charitable way to look at your ancestors, who would otherwise be roasting in eternal punishment. I told him that I thought it a strange view to have, given that we lived with these gods for thousands of generations, but the Christian God for barely 1 millennium, and for a very bloody millennium at that. Then he said something interesting. Isn't the opposite of what they're saying possible? If our ancestors were right, and the gods are part of our nature, might not the Christians who rejected or never knew this simple truth be trying to find them? And so they pushed and pulled this idea of one God in many directions, fighting over how he could be both father and son, and 100 other distinctions that they deemed worth killing for. Might the gods have been trying to speak to us, only we were too convinced of what we wanted to hear. And you know what I told him. I said, Ethelstan, you know that when a husband is unfaithful, it is up to him to make amends. He must take the first step to restore the relationship, not the one he turned his back on. Oh Christmas tree, how steadfast are your branches. Your boughs are green in summer's clime and through the snows of wintertime. 67. Steadfastness. Staying true. This, more than anything, was what characterized the relationship between the folk and their gods, for it meant nothing more nor less than staying true to their nature. Later, as they sat with the others, Brigid brought out a book and asked Liam to read it aloud. For your father, as she put it, her voice faltering only a little. Her son took the book and, to his credit, began to read with great animation to the little ones. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. 68. Phoebe had never heard this story before, and she laughed with the children at the right jolly old elf. When Liam had put the book aside, it was Brigid's turn to recount a much older story, one she and Connor would tell every year. 69. Long ago, twin sons were born to Odin and Frigga, and they named them Balder and Hoder. Balder was the handsomest of all the gods, and he was as good in character as in appearance. He was a peaceful god, no lover of war and quick to forgive. A just judge and an able peacemaker, he was able to reconcile the most stalwart of opponents. His brother Hoder was also handsome, but he had an impetuous, passionate nature, and was easily influenced. With his voice or with his harp, Hoder could move any heart to feel what he felt, and as an athlete and a fighter he was unparalleled. The two boys complemented each other, for Balder could calm Hodor's temperament, and the gods had high hopes that this generation would turn the tide. With Balder in the judgment seat and Hodor on the warpath, the enemies of the gods had much to fear. Balder married the daughter of Mani, god of the moon. Nanna was her name, whom the Greeks called Phoebe. They had a son, Forseti, who would become a god of justice just as his father was a god of peace. Hodor wished that he could have a wife as beautiful and as devoted as Nanna, but on his own, he would never have dreamed of taking her for himself. That came later. Now Hodor delighted in the hunt, and he was a great archer. One day, he was hunting alone in the ironwood. When night came, he found himself lost, but he followed a light that led him to a cave, and in it he found a beautiful woman. She welcomed him, but only so that she could bewitch him and take advantage of his violent passions. Clouding his mind with a potion, she kindled his lust for Nanna, encouraging him to take her away from his brother by force. Hodor was too ashamed to confront his brother directly in this, so instead he went over to the enemies of the gods. Devoured from within, he joined the devourers. But Balder overpowered him in combat and forgave his brother. His very forgiveness rankled Hodor, however, and the trust they had once enjoyed as twin brothers was forever lost. This suited the enemies of the gods just fine, for they sought at all costs to prevent the order and harmony that would result from the union of might and right. Balder began to have dark dreams of his own death. Once all the gods were in assembly, and all the goddesses as well, and the mighty ones discussed in council why ominous dreams had come to Balder. 70 Frigga, fearing for her son, decided that she would have all things in the cosmos promised to do Balder no harm. The devourers would not take such an oath, but she thought her son safe if everything by which a weapon could be made had done so. Thus every animal, every plant, every element took the vow, for the things of nature obey the law much more readily than those with a soul capable of defiance. At last she was satisfied that no harm would come to her son, as all the universe breathed the vow, all except a single, humble plant she had overlooked, a mistletoe growing on a tree in the ironwood. Loki learned of this, Loki who had secretly cast his lot with the enemies of the gods. He cut the mistletoe and took it to Wayland the smith, son of Ivaldi. The proud and haughty elf had never forgiven the gods for judging the creations of Sindri the dwarf to be superior to this own. Loki had him fashion an arrow from the mistletoe, one that would never miss its mark. The gods, free from worry over Balder, delighted in this game, since no axe, sword, rock, or arrow could harm him. They would hurl these at him and laugh when the weapons dropped harmlessly to the ground. Hodor also played this game with them, but one day Loki snuck the deadly arrow into his quiver. When Hodor shot it, the arrow struck Balder, and he fell to the ground, dead. With him died all the hopes of the gods. Odin bore the body of his son to the shore, where a ship awaited him, and on the ship a funeral pyre. Nanna, overcome with grief for her husband, died of a broken heart. By her husband they laid her, and Odin himself lit the fire. Then the father of the gods leaned down and whispered in his son's ear, but what he said no one knows. The ship, now afire, was drifted out to sea and engulfed in flames. Odin, his heart stricken by grief and his mind in turmoil for the future, saddled his horse and rode to the underworld to learn what the future might hold. There he learned more than he might wish, for he heard of the final days of this age, and he received that most terrible knowledge, the name of his own slayer. But Odin has not asked us to be ready to die the hero's death without being willing to do the same himself. Despite it all, grimly he smiled, for along with those dark tidings, he learned that Balder would return and rule over a universe remade. Some of Odin's other children would also survive the coming destruction. And until then, Balder and his beloved Nanna wait in the land of the dead. They say that Balder could return if every living thing in all the 9 worlds would but weep for him, but Loki is unwilling, and so there he remains. Hoder fled after the death of Balder, for though he had shot the arrow all unknowing, he felt that his previous actions would convict him. And indeed, it was the act of fleeing that made his guilt seem certain. Justice demanded that a brother's murderer be punished. And so it was, a brother slayer by a brother slain, for Odin fathered Vali, who at 1 day old was full grown, and at 1 day old fulfilled his duty. He slew Hoder before the god even comprehended the sorrow that his deed would cause. With the death of Balder, the best hope of the gods has also died. For a kind of quickening is upon us, the devourers grow in strength, and the giant nature within becomes hard to restrain. The world is winding down, moving toward the final battle, Ragnarok, the universal retribution. Odin knows, then, that the end is inevitable, but he does not give up. Instead, everything that he does is in order to ensure a future beyond that cataclysm. As Brigid described that end, which is also a beginning, Phoebe's thoughts return to the fall of Beargarth. When Brigid's father headed out the door to face the Lions of Detroit, surely he knew that he was about to die. And yet he did not lose heart. On the contrary, he called up all his might, so that there might be a future for his children. It brought to mind the words of an old poem Edelston had once read to her, words shouted by a leader to his men in the midst of a battle they knew they were going to lose. Thought must be the harsher, heart the fiercer, courage the greater, as our might lessens. 71. With the death of Balder, Brigid said, the might of the gods steadily succumbs to the relentless assaults of the devourers, and the forces of chaos grow stronger. A new age, a wolf age, dawns. Men cast off the bonds of time-honored traditions and sink into moral depravity. With virtue gone, law's main support vanishes, and war and anarchy soon follow. Even the seasons will be confounded. Brother shall fight brother, and be the death of each other. Sisters' children shall commit adultery with one another. It goes hard with the world. Great whoredom, an age of the axe, an age of the sword, shields split, an age of wind, a wolf age, before the world falls, and no man shall spare another. As virtue disappears, the natural order that the gods created begins to come apart at the seams, for it depends on the character of those who live within it. Edelston would speak like this of the retribution, Phoebe thought. We did it to ourselves. But all is not lost. Our deeds can help keep the chaos at bay for a while. For the world tree itself, like each one of us, feeds upon deeds, upon the layers of orlog in the well. Virtue keeps it strong and healthy. Thus, the entire universe is fed by our deeds. Everything we do matters, and the end, when it comes, is not truly an end, but only the close of one age and the opening of another. Tonight, then, they honored the birth of Balder, for dawn would bring the sun's triumph over winter, even though harsh months lay ahead. Just so, the universal cataclysm would bring not defeat, but victory. I see it rise up once more, from out of the waves, the evergreen earth, the waterfalls flow, the eagle flies above, soars over the mountain and catches fish. Afterwards, wondrous to see, the golden chess pieces will be found in the grass, those which the gods had in days of yore. I wonder, thought Phoebe, if one day we will come across the games with which our people entertained themselves, and wonder about them. Then fields unsown shall yield crops, wrongs will be righted, Balder will come, Hoder and Balder will dwell in Odin's victory hall, yes, the slain gods. I see a hall fairer than the sun, roofed with gold, on Gimle mountain, there shall the steadfast dwell, and enjoy happiness forever. 72 Then Leaf will come forth, Life, a woman whom the gods hid in the boughs of Yggdrasil. And with her shall come her husband, Lifthrasir, lover of life. They shall have children, and a new race of men will populate the remade earth. It was a story, Phoebe realized, that made sense of their world, that gave meaning to their lives. The modern world, the world whites had created, dismissed such things as myth, by which it meant untrue. In doing so, it had only created its own myth, the myth of progress. The believers in progress had fooled themselves into thinking they had dispensed with myth, even as they bound themselves more tightly to it. But unlike the old stories, the myth of progress assured them that the past was to be overcome, not remembered, that they need not heed its lessons or listen to its voices. They believed that there were no limits to what they could do, that everything would keep getting better, yet somehow require less and less effort. They were blind to the mounting evidence that their myth was far more fantastical than anything told by an ancient shaman. Man was undeniably becoming a monster, a thing repulsive to the eyes and offensive to the soul, but they had assured themselves that the machine would fix that, when in fact, it only accelerated the transformation. All the way up to the retribution they believed, and some clung to this myth even as they were lined up for sacrifice. 73. But here, in the forests around the northern sea, the folk had found meaning once more in the ancient stories, for they had the courage and the wisdom to recognize that they could not exist without myth. One cannot live or love, one cannot build or beget, one cannot even dine or dream, without myth to give it meaning. Lost in such thoughts, Phoebe looked up to find Brigid helping the little ones lay out carrots and hay outside the door, where a half-moon shone down on the glittering snow. Shivering from cold and excitement, the children came back in and made ready for bed. Imu, her baby asleep in her arms, headed upstairs to tuck in her sisters. Brigid, coming after her, motioned for Phoebe to follow. As they went up the creaking stairs, she turned to Phoebe and whispered, "I want to give Liam and Violet a moment together." "She is, after all, wearing a crown of mistletoe," his mother said with a twinkle in her eyes, "though she need not fashion an arrow out of it." Violet stayed only long enough to thank Brigid for her hospitality, for she wanted to return to her family before her brothers and sisters fell asleep. Although a woman now, like all who had yet to marry, she lived with her family, until it was time to set up a household with her husband. Liam followed her outside for a moment. When he came back in, he was in good spirits, and after talking with his mother and sister a while, he headed upstairs to the boys' room. Phoebe knew that he would see Violet tomorrow, and the sooner he fell asleep, she mused, the sooner that would come. But instead of slumber, a scream came from upstairs, then Liam shouting angrily, followed by laughter and the sound of something flung hard against the wall. Phoebe looked with concern at Brigid, but she was grinning. Liam's brothers, she explained, had grabbed a broom on their way up, and while he was downstairs with Violet, they had used one of their sister's nightclothes to fashion a straw-faced girl to await Liam in his bed. In such a way did Niall get back at his brother. The ladies talked of Liam and Violet, the other children, and the feast tomorrow, but by an unspoken agreement none of them mentioned their husbands. Much later, when all upstairs had been quiet for some time, Brigid went to her bedroom and returned with a large sack. Quietly, she began to take out the children's gifts, telling Phoebe mischievously, "The gifts of the gods are all around us and in us, but they want our hands to complete that loop." Phoebe smiled, and it made her think of the stone outside the Hall of Children and the message it bore, "You have been given a gift. Now be the giver." When all things were set for the morning, Phoebe made to go, but Brigid insisted that she stay. They had an extra bed in the girls' room, and Phoebe or Nimu could share her own bed. Thanking her for the kindness, Phoebe politely declined. What she could not explain was the need she felt to be alone tonight, not to weep or to pine, but to think. She felt a change coming on, something in the night, something pregnant and full of promise. She needed to be alone. Going out into the frigid air, where her breath condensed in clouds before her, she stepped through the blanket of snow that lay upon the ground. Silence had descended upon Wolfgarth. This was a time for families. What was it Brigid would say? Love around the hearth, frith in the garth. Yes, that was the atmosphere as she walked between the cabins, frith. Phoebe's own family was gone, victims of devouring by man or nature. Edelston was her family, Edelston and. But where was he tonight? And when would he return? When she entered their cabin, all the tiredness of the day descended upon her at once. The exhaustion grew, became heavier in fact with every step, preternaturally strong. She barely made it to bed before sleep overcame her. Phoebe dreamt that she was a seeress come to a settlement on the edge of a new world. The folk there were asking her to do something for them, to find a child that was lost, but she couldn't figure out what to do. They handed her a book and showed her the saga she had read. They'd done everything as it was in the book, they told her, and showed her the catskin gloves, and a pouch for charms, everything down to the ivory-handled, bronze-banded knife with its broken tip. All was there, the incidental along with the essential, with no clue as to which was which. Still Phoebe had no idea what to do. She told them, I have neither magical powers nor the gift of prophecy. They said she should sing the old chants. But the chants are not in the book, she replied. Gudrid was the last one to know the old ward songs, and as a Christian she would not have passed them down. But Phoebe's protests were in vain, for the terrible fact of the missing child hung over them, and her explanations came across as excuses. She began to cry, for she, too, feared for the missing child, but she had no idea what to do. One by one, the others walked away, disappointed. Finally, only one person remained, and Phoebe felt a kind hand on her shoulder, a woman's hand. She looked up, and it was Nimue. All at once Phoebe knew that the missing child was her sister Tara. Nimue took the book from her hands, and said, the answers aren't here, Phoebe, or anywhere else but in you. That's been our problem for centuries. We look everywhere for answers, for some revelation, for someone to free us from the burden of responsibility. But all this time, we've been carrying the answers inside us, in our own flesh and blood, in our folk soul. It's the one voice we didn't listen to. Listen to that voice, Phoebe. They could burn all our books, topple every temple, pull down every statue, but we would eventually find our way back, as long as we listen to the truth that courses through our veins. Nimue took off her cloak, and Phoebe saw that it was made of white feathers. Nimue placed it on her, but when Phoebe reached out her hand to feel it, all she felt was her own skin, for it had sunk into her own flesh, it had become a part of her. Then Nimue told her, one who has flown across continents can surely fly across the ironwood. In her dream, Phoebe stretched out her arms, and then she was flying high above. Far below, she could see Edelston moving through the forest, as these words sounded in her mind. There is an invisible tie that binds two who love, and distance has no power to break it. Suddenly, Phoebe awoke. It was still dark, and all was quiet. Nimue's words from the dream echoed in her mind. The answers aren't here, Phoebe, or anywhere else but in you. As she lay in bed, her mind flashed back through 100 moments. She thought back to the woman in the woods, and how she could see her own memories in the necklace. She thought of Edelston's poetry, and the words he had written. Folk called upon Freya to kindle desire. I call upon Phoebe, for she gives me fire. She saw a prophetess dressed in catskin. She felt the cool air as she leaned out a car window, but it was not Edelston driving, but her own father. Then Edelston was kneeling before her. She saw a prophetess dressed in catskin. She felt the cool air as she leaned out a car window, but it was not Edelston driving, but her own father. Then Edelston was kneeling before her, saying, "Where I am husbandi, you are Husfreya." She saw Brigid, as a little girl, running through the woods, saying, "Freya to send me the beauty she lends me." Then the forest resolved into a single tree, the Garth tree, and Edelston was standing next to it, as she heard herself tell him, "Happiest of all is that sight we long for, the sight of the one we love." What does it mean? Phoebe wondered. To become not desire, but desire's focus. To be possessed by beauty. Was this the key to how Edelston summoned this power in me? In all those moments by the fire, I felt his desire. I felt special enough to be someone's entire universe. There is a place in an eternity where that moment will exist forever and be the substance of an entire world. That moment, long ago, when my father took me for a drive, I felt magical. Edelston made me feel that again. Now I know that I am magical. Then she thought of Brigid's children, and the stockings hung by the fire. I have been given a gift. I've never thought of it that way, but it is. And with it, I have the power to give something to Brigid, and to Connor, and to Edelston, and maybe one day to the whole Garth, to the entire folk even. Without being able to explain exactly how, she felt a growing confidence that she would be able to find Connor, to find him without even leaving the Garth. She knew it was not something she could do at will, for it did not lie within her power to do so. But if she could find a way to enter the trance state, to invoke Freya's favor, to trust her as she trusted Edelston, then it could be done. Fear still haunted her, however, not the fear of failure but rather the fear of success. For if she succeeded in this, it meant that sooner or later, Edelston would be leaving for a much longer journey, to Sunset Mountains 1,000 miles away. It was awful to contemplate being apart from him for such an agonizingly long span of time. But then I won't be apart from him, she thought, not entirely. And what of Connor? And Brigid? And how many Brigids and Connors might be hiding in the continent's spine, cut off, hoping to hear of others like themselves? Asterisk 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 2 hours after dawn, Phoebe went over to Brigid's. The children were playing with their gifts, and Brigid and Nimue were in the kitchen, cleaning up after breakfast. Later today, the clans would hold the high feast of Yule, with Blot and Sumble. But Phoebe's mind was on another ceremony, and she had only a faint idea of what it might look like. She told Brigid she needed to speak with her privately, and the Husfreya took her to the bedroom. In that room, Connor's absence was palpable. Brigid was clearly curious as to what she had to say, and as Phoebe began to describe her visions, and the trances she had experienced, her curiosity only deepened. She doubted nothing, asked questions to clarify things here and there, and anticipated the conclusion Phoebe had drawn, that this same ability could be used to find her husband. Is there anything I can do? Yes, I'll need you and Nimue to help me. I know it's a lot to ask today, but if there's any way you can have someone else watch the children for a while, Brigid agreed without hesitation. She told Nimue, in briefer form, all that she had told Brigid, only this time it sounded rather absurd to Phoebe. But Nimue did not act in the least surprised. My mother told me about Tara. So I asked my sister once what it is that she would see. And Phoebe, she sighed slowly, then continued. I knew my brother, I remember him. When Tara described him, down to his cowlick and the way he called me, Nimmy. She has seen him, I know, she has met him. So I'm not shocked by what you tell me. Not at all. In many ways, I think, we are still newcomers to this universe. Nimue put her son to bed upstairs and brought Tara down. The girl looked at her with those color-shifting eyes, now green, now blue. But her oddness was no longer disconcerting to Phoebe. It only made her feel augmented in power. Brigid soon returned with Fiona, then put her down for a nap in the cradle. Closing the bedroom door, she rejoined the other three. Just tell us what you want us to do. Phoebe wasn't entirely certain. In a sense, she had done this before, when she had flown as a hawk without ever leaving her body. But in another sense, this would be entirely new, for it was not the expanse of time she wished to cross, but distance alone. Not to see the remote past, as before, nor even the shadows of what might be, as Thorbjorg had done, but to see more clearly what is. Looking around the room, she said, I'd like some kind of high seat. She remembered it from the saga, of course, though she was not trying to reproduce that moment in all its detail. This, however, seemed significant, especially once she remembered that other high seat, from which all the 9 worlds could be seen. Brigid pursed her lips in thought. Well, the only thing I can think of is the high chair in the kitchen. They entered the kitchen, and there was the high chair that had seen 9 children. Brigid slid the wooden tray off, and Phoebe found that she could fit in it. They brought the chair into the main room and placed it down in the center. Phoebe sat down in it, her feet not quite touching the floor but perched on a rung. Looking down, she decided to take off her shoes, so that she was barefoot. It reminded her of the painting she had seen in Edelston's book, The Priestess on the High Seat. She removed the pins from her hair and undid her braids, letting down her long hair. Then she looked around at Brigid, Nimue, and Tara in turn. 3 of them. Tara, I would like you stand in front of me. I want to let me look into your eyes and not look away from me. Is that all right? Tara nodded in understanding. Next Phoebe looked at Brigid and Nimue. She recalled her dream, when Nimue placed her hand on her shoulder. Nimue, I want you on my left side, and Brigid, you on my right. Stand a bit behind me, and each of you place a hand on my shoulders. Nimue's right hand, covered in the hex tekken, rested on Phoebe's left shoulder. Brigid's left hand, bearing her mother's dark-stoned wedding ring, rested on her right shoulder. Then Phoebe took Tara's hands in her own. She looked around one last time. It was like the pith in miniature. She was the tree, the axis, and around her stood 3 halls. And beyond them, what 3 paths might lead further out? She looked into Tara's eyes. I know I cannot initiate this, she thought, it was never me who did. But I need to make myself ready for the one who can, Freya. How should I address her? As Valfreya, the Lady of the Slain. She thought of Edelston's poem, Geffen, the Giver, for what she bestowed, Horn, for flaxen hair the wind blowed, and Goddess beautiful in tears. Mardal they would call her, for truth to tell, sea brightener, she makes the waves swell, when by the water she appears. Once again, names proved to be important, they carried power. Brigid, she asked, her eyes not straying from Tara's. What other names does Freya have? Brigid named some that Phoebe already knew, then one she did not, Venades. Freya is the Dis of the Vanir, the female guardian spirit of her tribe. Just as the Fetch is the Dis of the individual, and she can be seen as a mother, a sister, and a lover. A lover, yes. It was always Edelston, his voice, his touch, but he is not here now. He is the scavenger, who runs on wild paths in forest and city. I will have to find another way. Brigid, Nimue, keep one hand on my shoulders, but with the other, touch my neck. They moved their hands under her long hair, and when they touched her neck, the tingle was like Edelston's touch. While the electricity still coursed through her body, she called out, Venades. Then she was in those eyes, diving deep, and she heard Tara whisper, I see 2 women behind my mother and sister. One looks like you, but she is older, and holds a book. The other one is older still. Phoebe spoke, but whether it was with her lips or her mind she did not know. That is my mother and my grandmother. Tara went on. And I can see someone else, someone behind me, reflected in your eyes. I see her, Tara. Keep looking at me. Her name is Nausicaa. There is someone behind you, Tara went on, a man standing between them. He looks like my father, but not as tall. He's wearing a blue shirt, and it's dirty. Phoebe's voice caught. It's my daddy, Tara. Tears welled up in her eyes. He looks so kind. He's smiling at you. Deep in Tara's eyes, Phoebe thought she could just make out the reflection of her father, but she dared not break the connection. I can feel someone else, to my left, Tara went on. Another man, I think. Without leaving Tara's eyes, Phoebe could just make out the black patch that covered one eye. Heard Bridget's voice, and Nimue joined it. Chant like 9 worlds I remember, the 9 in the tree beyond measure, that springs from below. 74 Phoebe felt that falling she knew so well. No longer did she see Tara's eyes. She blinked, and found herself looking down from impossibly high up. She was an eagle. Over a snowy landscape she flew, looking down at a double line of white hills. The Iron Shield. She was soaring northwest, her great wings beating against the frigid air. In the distance she saw a peak rising above the surrounding plain, and on it a tower supporting a great runway slanting skyward, the high seat. As she approached, 2 birds flew off, one to the east, one to the west. With sharp eagle eyes she saw that they were ravens. Phoebe glided closer, then with wings bent back, claws extended, she alit on the high seat. Scanning in all directions, she took in all things. To the southwest, she saw the pre-ret town of Ironwood. There's something strange and massive caught her eye, and she peered closer. It was the figure of a giant, over 50 feet tall, dwarfing all the abandoned houses nearby. He was staring back at her. Focusing, she saw that it was a huge statue of a red Indian. With his right hand extended palm up, he appeared to be pointing downward. Phoebe followed the line, and at his feet she saw a small fire, and near it 2 shadows. Straining her eyes, she saw a man bound. His body was slumped, his right sleeve blood-stained, his head lolling weakly. Connor. Nearby squatted another man, his beard scraggly, his hair wild, his knife glinting in the firelight. A werewolf. Not far away were others of his kind. Panicking, Phoebe took to the air, flying rapidly in the direction of the giant. Even as she did so, she realized that there was little she could do. Frantically, she looked all about. And then to the west, she saw him, saw the 2 of them trudging north of the Iron Shield, beyond the reach of the werewolves. She changed course now, and long before she reached them, she began dropping altitude, coasting low over the treetops. Suddenly, they appeared below her, crossing a clearing not far from the ruins of Highway 2. Phoebe cried out, and it came as an eagle's shriek. Landing on the ground in front of them, she looked at her husband. The scavenger bird beheld the scavenger man. Ethelstan, my noble stone. Behind him, who escaped, but Ethelstan's attentive look showed that he knew something extraordinary was happening, and he intended to hearken to it. She cried out again and edged her way closer to him. He got down on his knees and held out his left arm. With a little hop, she landed upon it, her claws gripping his tough leather sleeve. Affectionately, she bent down and rubbed her beak against his arm, then found his hand and gave little raps against his ring, the ring Leonidas once wore. Feathers. I told you that you were more special than I am. And here is the proof. He chuckled, and all this time I had assumed old Jeff was a he. But why have you come to me? She called to him softly now, a high-pitched piping sound. Lowering her head, she rooted on her chest as if preening, but plucked out a long feather with her beak. She then jumped up onto his shoulder and placed the feather on the back of his head. When it fell down, she hopped to the ground, picked it up with her beak, and hopped back up to his shoulder. His hair was too short to hold the feather, but on her third attempt to position it, Ethelstan put his hand on the back of his head and held the feather in place. Satisfied, she hopped to the ground. His hand still there, Ethelstan watched her, deep in thought. Quietly, he said, like an Indian, Phoebe. A red Indian. His eyes grew wide in recognition. You've seen the giant Indian, Phoebe. The one that watches the north. Have you seen Connor there? Phoebe emitted a deafening shriek and flew into the air. She circled the two men, watched as they altered course, heading east toward Ironwood. She flew in front, impatient of their speed. It would be an hour before they could reach him, across the north ridge of the shield and on the other side of the city. Long before they reached the ridge, she felt herself falling, not from the sky but from consciousness. Down, down, she slumped, almost toppling from the high chair, but Nimue and Brigid held onto her shoulders. Her eyes no longer met Tara's, no longer swam in those bottomless, blue-green depths. Gingerly they laid her down on the floor, and Brigid put Phoebe's head on her lap, smoothing her hair as she might comfort one of her children. Phoebe lay there long after she had recovered, wondering how she could tell Brigid what she had seen. She knew then what torment knowledge could bring, why Odin screamed as he picked up the runes that revealed the universe's mysteries. She had seen Connor, alive, and Ethelstan and Koos were now headed for him. All this should be cause for joy to Brigid. But how, she wondered, shall I tell her that Connor is sightless, that he looked uselessly about with two blackened pits where once eyes had been? Somehow Phoebe found a way to tell Brigid what she saw, and to prepare her for what state she would find her husband in. That the three men would return, Phoebe had no doubt. The werewolves had sown the wind and would reap the whirlwind. Ironwood held no terrors for one who had been inside the bunker and carved his way out. Brigid did not go to the high feast that day. It was Nimue who took the children to the festivities at Raven Clan's hall, while Phoebe stayed with Brigid. Afterwards, the three women talked but little, and that night, when Nimue went upstairs with her baby to her old bed, Phoebe joined Brigid in hers, holding her as Connor's wife cried softly. The next day, Brigid had recovered sufficiently to think about preparing the children for their father's return. Gathering them about, she told them that their father had been alone in the woods, that he was hurt, but Ethelstan and Koos had gone to get him. They would do everything they could to bring him back safely. The children, apart from Ronan, who was too little to understand, took it stoically. They knew their father was a ranger, knew he dealt in violence, knew there were terrible evils in the world. But until their father returned to them after such a long absence, it was all rather abstract. Tara alone was overcome with emotion, as if she fully grasped the awful reality. Phoebe dimly remembered that after she had collapsed from atop the high chair and was lying in Brigid's arms, Tara had run upstairs. Perhaps she could see through my eyes as I saw through hers. Phoebe wondered. At Brigid's insistence, several members of the Women's Council were summoned and brought before Phoebe, who told them the bare facts, that Connor had been captured near Ironwood, that he was severely injured, but Ethelstan and Koos were bringing him back. Did she see this in a dream? They asked. No, Phoebe replied, for there is a state neither dream nor waking, and in it I have seen them as surely as you see me. Her manner was confident, matter of fact, quite different from that moment, which now seemed so long ago, when she had stood before them and felt more apprehension than before the men's council. The women listened to what she had to say but withheld judgment, knowing that the trueness of the arrow's course can be properly judged only when the target is examined. The members of the men's council were also informed. They were more inclined to accept her report as a statement of fact. Perhaps, Phoebe thought, recalling the observations of the Roman, because they are men. Some of them suggested sending a party south to meet the trio, but one of the rangers pointed out that doing so would not speed their return. Edelston and Koos would have put Connor on a litter. Their pace would be walking speed, with many stops, limited not by their tiredness but by Connor's condition. The following day, as the sun lowered over the horizon, shouts went up from the Garth wall. The men had come to the Ranger Ring and were being escorted the rest of the way. They would be arriving not at the Germanic gate but at the Slavic. The three women left Colleen in charge of the other children and headed there. When they arrived, Connor had already been brought inside. Although Brigid had been prepared for a shock, she had not actually seen Connor, as Phoebe had. His condition was much worse than it had been 2 days ago. Deathly pale, he coughed violently, bundled up but still shaking from chills. Where a bandage covered his right shoulder, an arm had once hung, a decision that must have weighed heavily on Edelston and Koos. Fortunately, his sightless eyes were covered in cloth, but knowing what lay underneath made imagination run wild with its own terrible conjurations. Brigid wept and held her husband's head in her hands as his heavy breathing rasped. Deep in his lungs, an infection had taken root. Edelston stepped forward, his face grave. Set in. He laid his hand on her shoulder. I am no healer, Lady Brigid, but I fear he is near death. I think we should take him to your cabin, where he can be around those he loves. Brigid, wiping away her tears, assented. 2 other men joined Edelston and Koos to bear the litter. Watching the 4 men, Phoebe thought that they looked like pallbearers, like the rednecks who once carried her father's cheap coffin to the furnace that would consume his body. Like Sleipnir, she realized, this, too, has 8 legs, and it travels between worlds. So they went along, horse and rider, as the folk of the Garth gathered on either side of the road. Brigid walked beside Connor, her hand on his chest. As they neared her house, Phoebe offered to take Brigid's children over to her cabin. Thank you, but no. If my husband is to die, then my children ought to see him in his last moments. Imu stepped through the door and shooed the children out of the way, taking her son from Colleen. The men brought him in and laid him down by the fire rather than the bed, so that he might feel its warmth. Connor's children stood about, wide-eyed and silent. Fiona was asleep in the bedroom, but Brigid asked Phoebe to get her, so that they might all be present. Picking up Fiona from the cradle, Phoebe rocked her gently to keep her from making noise, then came back to behold a mournful scene. Brigid was kneeling by her husband's left side, on the other side of the fire. She was running her hands through his dark hair, while his lips moved and his head turned to her, as if his sightless eyes could see his wife. His breath came in labored gasps as he struggled to speak. My sweet Brigid, I can never, he coughed violently, never look upon your face again. Or see my children grow. I am no good for this life. No, Brigid insisted. That's not true. She spoke words then that Phoebe recognized as those of Odin, from the Havamal, the sayings of the High One. They expressed the ancient folk wisdom of a fair race, the sense that every life was worth keeping, that no infant or man was useless, regardless of injury or deformity. The lame man rides a horse, the handless herds cattle, the deaf man can fight and win. The blind man is better than the one on the pyre, for a dead man benefits none. 75 Connor let out a long sigh. Ah, Brigid, you always did have the better of me at words. His body shook as he coughed. The man's life was ebbing. Fragments came now, pieces from the past, borne back tides of memory. Brigid, you must come with me now. Our parents are dead. The Garth is gone. But here, take my hand. I will stay with you. His breathing became labored. Brigid laid her face on his chest and cried as Phoebe had never seen a woman cry. Suddenly he clutched at her, as if seeing something terrible or wondrous far away, and he spoke again. I see them, Brigid. I see them. My mother and father, my brother Aiden, so big. Little Maureen, where did you go? Oh, I looked for you that day. I didn't mean to leave you. Please forgive me. Oh, Brigid, I want to go to them. Tears filled Phoebe's eyes, too, as the events of that day in Bear Garth played out before them. Brigid raised her head from his chest and implored her husband. No. I've lost everyone. I can't lose you. I can't live without you, Connor. Phoebe shuddered then, for she thought she heard the flutter of wings, and the wind gently blowing at the veil. Then, something unaccountable happened. Brigid stopped short and looked at her husband as if an idea had just occurred to her. Bending down to his ear, she whispered something that only he could hear. A moment passed, his lips moving as if he were trying to grasp the meaning of what she had said. All at once, his left arm tightened, and he raised his hand up, gripping the air. She placed her left hand in his, and Phoebe could see him squeeze it powerfully, the knuckles widening. This was not the grip of a dying man. He let out a low growl that grew in strength and volume, as if he were charging into battle. To Phoebe's astonishment, he began to raise himself off the floor through their grip, his arm muscles bulging. Like one of the clan's heroes from the ballad, Jim Bowie, up from the grip of the grave, gripping weapons. 76 Brigid put her right arm behind him to support him as he reached a sitting position, as his bandaged, sightless eyes sought her breast. Kneeling there, she held him close, and he nuzzled against her, content. They were silent then, as new tears fell from Brigid's eyes, tears of thankfulness for her husband's return from the precipice. Phoebe would often wonder what Brigid had whispered to Connor. Had she made some heartfelt declaration of love? Or was it to that day at Bear Garth she returned, recalling something only known to them? Or did she suspect that it was only a matter of willpower holding him back, and, having failed through tenderness, had she tried a different tack? Had she told him that if he gave up, he was no kin to his patron tier, the one-handed god? Anger was a powerful motivator for a man, Phoebe knew. Or did she whisper something even more private? Had it been something that only lovers say, and none else might know? Perhaps when everything else has been stripped away, even the will to live, there lies at the ancient core of a man desire, and one last fire to be kindled. Despite her curiosity, Phoebe knew she would never ask Brigid what she said to Connor, for man and wife share secrets none can know. She remembered a story she had heard, of how Odin left Frigga on a dangerous mission, as he often did, to gain the wisdom he sought from a giant, those most ancient of beings. It was a contest of wits, always dangerous, and Odin went in disguise. There he learned much of the forces that were gathering in strength to undo the world. They were the questions of a god, like a man, concerned with his own posterity. Then Odin, still in disguise, won the battle of wits by asking an unanswerable question, that no one but Odin himself could know. Far have I traveled, much have I dared, much have I gained from the gods. What did Odin say in his son's ear before he stepped to the funeral pyre? 77 What had Odin whispered in his son's ear, as Balder lay on the funeral pyre? What mystery lay there, in words spoken by a father to his dead son? To a son who would one day return from the land of the dead to avenge his father after he fell in the fight. Put to this final question, the giant finally realized to whom he had been speaking all along, for none but Balder's father could know the answer to that question. And so a similar, private mystery passed between husband and wife, as Brigid held Connor against her breast and wept tears of joy, and he murmured softly to his wife. Phoebe, feeling suddenly like an intruder on this scene, retreated to where the children were standing. Feeling a hand on her shoulder, she turned around. It was Edelston, her scavenger. He embraced her, and she, too, wept freely. Connor's fever broke, but he slept for days, recovering slowly, conscious for only a few moments. Perhaps, Phoebe thought, he was awake more than they knew, listening to the sounds of his family as he lay in the bedroom, taking strength from their frith to heal his body. For though hard days might come, the victory was won. So, too, was the sun's rise on the solstice triumphant, for though winter's end was months away, a deeper victory had now been proclaimed. Brigid attended to him through these days and nights, while Nimue helped keep the household on an even keel. Both women were in high spirits, or at least gave everyone else that impression. Phoebe checked in on occasion, but she spent those days with Ethelstan, cherishing his presence as never before. Only now that he was back in her arms did she fully comprehend the depths of the loneliness she had felt in his absence. This is something I will feel again, she realized, for I am the scavenger's wife. But while the pain will always be there, I find it easier to bear, knowing that I can see him, I can follow him, I can even protect him as he crosses the continent. For like the wolves Jerry and Freki who attend Odin, I can follow him through the forest. Like Freya's wildcats, I can lope along at his side. Everyone in the garth came to hear of what had happened in that little cabin off the Celtic. Thus they came to know that, 7 years after receiving a scavenger, they had been delivered a seer. Or rather, a seeress, Phoebe thought, reveling in the feminine nature of her calling. For this is my calling, this is my gift, and now I will be the giver. With my Ethelstan possessed by the spirit of death, I will be possessed by life, the life of paw and hoof and wing. One beautiful, dread goddess unites us both. Ethelstan told her, as he told Brigid, that Connor's captor had proven to be one of their own from long ago, the young buck whom the Garth had exiled nearly a quarter century before. Once a wolf, he had degenerated into a werewolf, a man kinless, friendless, joined to others of his own kind but never trusting them. In Ironwood, Loki-like, he nursed his hatred, and that proved to be an offspring as monstrous as Fenris. When Connor came across his path, wounded and wandering, fate seemed to have given him everything his black heart desired. Here at last was a chance to avenge his suffering on one who had been a young buck with him. The other werewolves joined in gladly, for even with his right arm useless, Connor felled several of their number. They reveled in the torture, and would have done far worse had Ethelstan and Koos not arrived when they did. Werewolves, and he and Koos had to fight many as they made their way into that fell city. 6 more paid with their lives at the base of the Indian before they reached the 7th, Connor's captor. Ethelstan, bearing death in his hand, told the outcast that he was worse than a Nithing, the ancient word for the villains destined to walk the cold wastes of Niflheim, where they would die a second death at the hands of that world's foul creatures. A Nithing he certainly was, but he was also a nothing, and Ethelstan showed him the many notches on his knife, telling him that he wouldn't even merit that recognition in death. Notches were for slain men, and he was no man. Then Ethelstan sped him down the Hellrod, where his ancestors awaited in judgment. The 2 men left his body there, at the place where the giant stood looking north, his great hand pointing down to where a nameless corpse lay at his feet. *******. A week after Connor's return, it was 12th night, the first day of the year and the end of Yuletide. When the first sun of the year 2108 dawned, it shone on no people more grateful than those living in these 2 cabins a stone's throw apart, in a village walled by a palisade, deep in the forests around the northern sea. Phoebe and Ethelstan came around to see Connor. He was still weak, but the ranger had a powerful will, and it was clear he was slowly gaining the upper hand over the forces that would have dragged him down. He was sitting in a chair when they came by, a blanket around his broad shoulders. "Is that you, Phoebe?" he said, his voice loud and strong. "If the retribution could produce someone like you, maybe it's not all bad." Then he laughed hoarsely. Brigid took Phoebe into the kitchen and hugged her. "You have given us so much, Phoebe, you and Ethelstan. I want to thank you." Her voice caught, and they held each other tight. No further words were needed. From the other room, Phoebe heard Edelston say to Connor, "We've sent word to Liam. He's been given leave to come today." "Good," Connor commented. "And make sure to tell him that the bastard's dead, so he can't pull a trick like you did and abandon his post." At Connor take it easy at home, but he insisted on attending. His gruff exterior was a fierce love of life, a life devoted to those he loved. Watching Brigid fuss over him made Phoebe realize how much he loved her for it. Tara had come downstairs. Phoebe went to her and thanked her for all her help that day, hoping to discover some sign of what impact those events had had on the child. But Tara only beamed and said, "Thank you for bringing back my daddy." Though possessed of a rare gift, she was still a child. Colleen and Maureen came downstairs, with little Ronan tripping at their feet. The girls presented their father with the fruit of several days' labor, though Ronan was quick to claim credit, as well, 2 black eye patches made of leather. Feeling them in his hands, their father was quite impressed, and immediately put them on, crossing the straps behind his head. Phoebe observed Niall, who was keeping his distance off to the side, still uncertain about the changes in his father. Once the patches were on, Connor looked over his shoulder toward his son and asked, "What do you think?" Niall, disconcerted by his father's apparently sightless sight, asked, "How did you know I was standing over here?" "How? Your silence is deafening, my boy. Now come over here and give me a hug." Embracing his son, he said in a more serious tone, "Now, I'm going to need you to help me. I seem to have lost my right arm, and until I find it, I'm going to need you to be my right arm. Remember what the stone at the Hall of Men says. In Ter's right hand lies our strength. Right, and that's just a hand. I have a whole arm gone, so I'm going to need you to be even stronger for me. Think about it. Liam's gone this year. We'll see him 7 more times and he'll be a man. That leaves you. I'm going to need to rely on you for a lot around here. Can you do it?" Niall straightened, intoning solemnly, "Yes, father. I can do it." "Good. What about me?" Ronan asked, pressing himself against his father's lap. "Don't bother him," Niall said. No, just wait a minute," Connor chided. "What about you?" "Well, that's something I've been thinking about. Now I'm pretty sure," he mused thoughtfully, "that you can see better than I can." Ronan nodded in agreement with this statement. "So I'm going to need you to be my eyes. Tell me when I'm about to trip over something. Especially," he smiled, "if it's you." The day passed in friths such as this. Later, Edelston and Coos lent him their shoulders to lean on, for he insisted on walking to the clan hall. Spirits were high at the Sumble. As they feasted together, Edelston and Connor sparred playfully. "You know," Edelston said, "Odin sacrificed only one eye, and I seem to recall that he came back with great wisdom." Connor, one-upping him, replied, "Perhaps my eyes are like his 2 ravens, thought and memory. They fly across the 9 worlds and bring me tidings." "And what tidings did they bring you?" Connor turned his head to where Brigid held Fiona and rested his hand on his baby girl. "They tell me that it is good to be alive." Later, as the others were singing, Phoebe took Edelston by the hand and led him outside, to the frost-cold, moonlit night. His eyes. "I'm going to have our child." "How do you know?" he said incredulously. "I just know. It has been more than 2 months." He embraced her then, and she sank into his arms. And though it might have been the bitter cold that began it, her eyes had reason enough to fill with tears. As all that had happened in these months flowed through her, she wept. She wept for all the women of her race who had ended that long line by not having children, then spent the rest of their lives trying to fill the emptiness they felt. She wept for those who shed their identity like an outworn garment, mixing their blood and abandoning As all that had happened in these months flowed through her, she wept. She wept for all the women of her race who had ended that long line by not having children, then spent the rest of their lives trying to fill the emptiness they felt. She wept for those who shed their identity like an outworn garment, mixing their blood and abandoning a uniqueness it took countless ages to forge. She wept for a world without real men, for that meant a world without fathers, where violence recognized no principle, and virtue cowered. And she wept for a world that hated children, that corrupted them whenever it could, but preferred most of all to prevent their ever having been. She also cried for her mother and father and grandmother, who wouldn't be here to see her child. But they were here, she realized. Only a thin veil separated them, a veil they could whisper through, to send out their love and hope and strength, a veil she was occasionally permitted to see through. And there was joy in her tears. Joy for the world to which Ethelstan had brought her. Joy for the man to which a goddess had delivered her. Joy for the awakening of a folk that would not be subdued, that would overcome every obstacle and find a way. 3 Garths there were, and a 4th in memory, huddled about the northern sea. Mary Ann Stokes, Tristan and Isolde. Public domain. Appendix A. On Rigsula. The most common interpretation of Rigsula, most of which Ethelstan presents in Chapter 5, is that it explains the class divisions of Germanic society and perhaps even of Indo-European society as a whole. The first couple's child is named Thrall, which can denote anything from a slave to a serf to a tenant, here translated, laborer. The second couple's child is Carl, designating someone from the class of free farmers or artisans. Then we have the class of warriors, out of which the Jarl Earl, chieftain, the third couple's child, comes. From the secular perspective of scholars such as Georges de Maisel, this work is thus clearly a justification of a class, or even a caste system, giving such a division divine sanction. However, as Ossard points out, this would be a pretty weak justification for class distinctions, because all of the children are properly those of Rig Heimdall, and each of them could equally claim divine origin. 78 writers from an Asatru perspective, such as Edred Thorson and Stephen McNallen, give a different twist to de Maisel's interpretation. The myth, they argue, shows how all the folk share in our God's nature, regardless of class. As McNallen argues, the implication of this kinship is that our destiny is to grow ever more like the gods themselves. 79. One can agree with the truth of that last statement and yet still observe that the various couples Heimdall encounters are at vastly different stages along that path. Indeed, the descriptions and names of the thrall's children, which I have not included, are downright insulting. Horse, lewd, and oaf are among the sons, and the daughters include thick calves, hearth nose, and crane-legged. If the Rigsula makes a poor justification for class distinctions, it does an equally poor job of according special dignity to each class, assuming that were its intended purpose. However, a third perspective is possible, one that is chronological rather than sociological. The first key lies with the names of each couple that Rig Heimdall encounters. First, great-grandfather I, and great-grandmother Edda, then grandfather Afi, and grandmother Amma, and finally father Fathier, and mother Mothier. These names are clearly chronological, and it would be rather foolish to interpret them as simultaneously existing couples. 3 conclusions can be tentatively drawn from this alone. First, the terms are not meant to indicate age, for great-grandfather and great-grandmother are not, like Abraham and Sarah, past their normal childbearing years. Second, that same chronology is meant to be much longer than 3 generations, for the children of the great-grandparents are not the grandparents, nor are father and mother the children of the grandparents. Finally, if the author had intended to indicate 3 different lines of descent, as might befit a class justification narrative, it would make no sense to give them these names, which indicate a single sequence, however long. The word used at the end of each section, et plural. Edir is usually translated as generations, kindreds, or even the race, as in, thence come the generations of thralls. But this word can refer not only to pedigree or the family extraction of contemporaneous people, but also chronological generations. The second key, which Ossard discusses, becomes clear from the changes in living conditions as the narrative progresses. The great-grandparents live in a very primitive state, with a fire set in the floor, coarse food, and a simple shelter for a home. They are, in fact, described as wearing aldenfalda, or ancient clothes. With Heimdall's evolutionary intervention, their children advance to simple agriculture and animal husbandry. On the second stop of his journey, the grandparents are well dressed and in a comfortable home, the wife spinning yarn. Their children, in turn, the fruit of Heimdall's intervention, begin new crafts. The evolution picks up again in his third visit, this time to father and mother, who live in an even more civilized or refined state. Of course, one could argue that the lower classes of most eras tend to live in a more primitive state, with less leisure time and less access than the wealthy to advanced technology. This aligns with the usual interpretation of the Rigsala, which the terms thrall, carl, and jarl seem to support. However, in light of the points listed above, it seems more probable that the couples are exactly as they are presented, chronological links in the chain of our descent. As for these three terms, which indicate specific classes in the context of medieval Scandinavian society, they would be the ones most readily available to describe the life of man at each stage of existence. In other words, everyone once lived as a thrall does. Once we join Rigsala to the origins story of Ask and Embla provided by Valispa, we have a complete narrative of how we got here, which is one function of myth. As Ossard points out, that it dovetails so neatly with science is rather awe-inspiring. It is an evolutionary model, but one that answers some of the questions with which simple evolution might leave us. On the other hand, it also bears an affinity to some creationist models, in that there is divine intervention, interestingly enough, through the very mechanism of our own biology, or what Macnallan calls the body-soul complex. Appendix B. Map of Wolfgarth.